Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. The radio crackled to life on the passenger seat beside me as I drove up the narrow gravel road toward the mountains. Static popped and fizzled, followed by the sharp voice of my supervisor, Walt. "Martin, you got a copy?" I grabbed the radio without taking my eyes off the winding road. The trees on either side loomed thick and dark, the evening sun barely filtering through. "Yeah, I'm here. What's up?" "Got a report of some campers gone missing up near Black Ridge. Bunch of kids from out of town, probably drunk or stoned out of their minds. Need you to check it out before nightfall hits." "How long they been missing?" 2 days. Parents finally called it in. Said they were supposed to be back yesterday. We've already tried getting a signal on their phones, but nothing's pinging." I muttered a curse under my breath. "On it. Send me the last coordinates." As the radio clicked off, I felt that familiar knot tighten in my stomach. I'd been a forest ranger for over 10 years, but something about the wilderness around Black Ridge always unsettled me. It was vast and unforgiving, the kind of place that swallowed people whole. Not the first time someone went missing out here, and it probably wouldn't be the last. I punched the coordinates into my GPS and drove in silence, the steady hum of my truck the only sound for miles. The sun was already dipping low behind the jagged peaks, casting long shadows across the forest floor. If I didn't hurry, I'd be out here in the dark. By the time I reached the trailhead, it was eerily quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're not alone, even when you are. I grabbed my pack and flashlight, clicked on the radio, and checked in with Walt one last time. "I'm at the start of the trail. I'll head in, see if I can find anything." "Copy that. Watch your back. You know how these mountains get at night." I clipped the radio to my belt and started down the trail. The path was narrow, overgrown in some spots, like no one had been here in a long time. The trees were thick, branches hanging low, and every so often I'd hear the snap of a twig off in the distance, just faint enough to make me wonder if I was imagining it. The coordinates led me deeper into the forest, and after about 30 minutes of walking, I started to see signs of the kids. Beer cans scattered in the dirt, a couple of cigarette butts still half-smoked. I bent down to pick one up, inspecting the ash. Not too old, they hadn't been gone long. But then I noticed something else. The ground was disturbed, like someone had dragged something heavy through the underbrush. Footprints were scattered everywhere, leading off the trail, and mixed in with the smaller ones were prints that didn't belong, larger, heavier. My pulse quickened. I stood up, listening. The wind rustled the leaves, and somewhere far off, a bird called out. But there was something else, something deeper, almost like footsteps. I followed the trail of disturbed earth, moving cautiously, my hand instinctively going to the handle of the knife strapped to my belt. As I pushed through the dense trees, I stumbled upon the campsite. It was a mess. Tents were half-collapsed, sleeping bags tossed around like someone had left in a hurry. A campfire had burned out, the ashes still smouldering faintly in the pit, but it was the silence that got me. No sign of the kids, no backpacks, no phones, no food. It was like they had just vanished. I crouched down, examining the site more closely. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no torn fabric, but the ground was torn up as if something, or someone, had been moving quickly. Panic, maybe. Then I saw the prints again. Large, deep prints leading away from the campsite, back into the forest. I stared at them for a long time, trying to make sense of it. They weren't like anything I'd seen before, too big for a human, too long for a bear, but they were deliberate, spaced evenly apart, like something had walked right up to the camp and then back into the woods. The sky was fading fast, the last light disappearing behind the mountains. I fished my flashlight from my pack and flicked it on, the beam cutting through the encroaching darkness. I knew I should call it in, but something made me hold back. Curiosity, or maybe something else. I followed the prints, keeping my steps light and careful. The forest was dense here, branches scratching at my arms as I pushed through. The air felt colder, and the quiet weighed on me like a blanket. The deeper I went, the stranger it got. The ground became more uneven, and I had to watch my footing as I descended into a narrow valley. The prints were still there, clearer now, and in the distance I thought I heard something, a faint sound, almost like breathing. I stopped, holding my breath, listening. Nothing. I moved forward again, my pulse thudding in my ears, my flashlight flicking back and forth across the trees. That's when I saw it. Ahead, at the base of a steep ridge, something was moving. At first, I thought it was an animal, a bear maybe. But as I got closer, I realized it was standing, too tall to be anything natural. My hand instinctively tightened around the handle of my knife as I crouched behind a tree, watching. It was dark, whatever it was, blending into the shadows of the forest. But I could see the outline. It was massive, hunched over like it was dragging something behind it. I strained my eyes, trying to see more, but the shadows kept it concealed. Then it stopped. It turned its head, just slightly, like it had heard me. My heart jumped into my throat. I froze, barely daring to breathe. It was looking right in my direction, and I could feel the weight of its gaze even from that distance. Then it dropped what it was holding and bolted. The speed was terrifying. It moved through the trees like it was born there, disappearing into the blackness in a matter of seconds, but not before I got a glimpse of what it had been dragging. My blood ran cold. It was one of the kids. I sprinted forward, heart hammering, my flashlight beam shaking as I ran. The kid, a boy, maybe 16, was unconscious, but alive. His clothes were torn, and his face was pale, streaked with dirt and blood, but I couldn't see any obvious injuries. I knelt beside him, checking his pulse, faint, but there. I grabbed my radio, breathless. "Walt, I found one of them. He's alive, but something's out here." There was a pause on the other end. Then Walt's voice crackled back, sharp. "What do you mean, something? Martin, what the hell's going on?" "I don't know. I don't know what it is, but it's big and it's fast. I'm bringing the kid back now, but we need to send a team. There might be others." "Roger that. Get him out of there now." I scooped the boy up, throwing his arm over my shoulder, and started back up the ridge, my legs burning with the effort. The forest seemed darker, more oppressive now, like it was closing in around me. Every snap of a branch made me flinch. Every rustle of leaves sent my heart racing. I kept moving, focused on getting back to the trailhead. But the whole time, I felt like I was being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see those eyes again, glowing from the darkness. When I finally broke through the trees and saw the glint of my truck in the moonlight, I nearly collapsed with relief. I hoisted the kid into the passenger seat and slammed the door, my hands shaking as I got in and started the engine. As I pulled away, my headlights cut through the trees, and for a brief moment I thought I saw something standing at the edge of the woods. Tall, hunched, watching. But when I blinked, it was gone. We never found the rest of the kids. A search team combed the area for days, but it was like they had vanished. No bodies, no gear, nothing. Just the boy I'd found, and he couldn't remember a thing. The mountains keep their secrets well. But every time I head back up that way, I can't shake the feeling that something's watching me from the trees, something that didn't like being interrupted. Story 2. The howl pierced the night, unlike anything I'd ever heard in my years of hiking these mountains. It wasn't a wolf or a coyote or even a mountain lion. This sound chilled me to my core, a primal wail that set every hair on my body on end. I gripped my flashlight tighter, scanning the dark forest around me. Whatever made that sound, I knew I had to investigate. It was my job, after all, even if every instinct screamed at me to run. My name's Kaito Nakamura, and I'm the newest ranger at Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest. At 23, I'm the youngest on the team, and tonight was my first solo night patrol. I'd begged for this shift, eager to prove myself. Now, as another unearthly howl echoed through the trees, I was starting to regret my enthusiasm. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. "Come on, Kaito," I muttered. "You've got this." My voice sounded small in the vast darkness of the forest. I flicked on my radio, my lifeline to civilization. "Base, this is Ranger Nakamura. I'm investigating an unusual animal sound near Lookout Creek. Over." Static crackled, then a familiar voice responded. "Copy that, Kaito. Be careful out there. Check in every 15 minutes. Over." "Will do. Over and out." I clicked off the radio and started moving towards where I thought the sound had come from. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating a narrow path ahead. The forest was alive with night sounds, the rustle of small animals, the hoot of an owl, the whisper of wind through the trees. But underneath it all was an eerie silence, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. My boots crunched on fallen leaves and twigs as I made my way deeper into the woods. The air was crisp with the bite of early autumn, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. I'd always loved this smell, but tonight it seemed ominous, masking other scents that might warn me of danger. After about 10 minutes of careful walking, I reached a small clearing. The trees opened up to reveal a patch of sky, the stars twinkling coldly overhead. I swept my flashlight around the area, heart pounding. That's when I saw it. At first, all I could make out was a massive, dark shape hunched over something on the ground. It was easily 8 feet tall, even crouched down. Thick, shaggy fur covered its body, matted in places with what looked like mud or blood. My breath caught in my throat. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. A bear. It had to be a bear. But I'd never seen one this big, or moving quite like this. I took an involuntary step back, and a twig snapped under my boot. The creature's head whipped around, and 2 gleaming eyes reflected the beam of my flashlight. They were unnaturally large, and for a moment I could have sworn they glowed with an inner light. Time seemed to stop as we stared at each other. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My hand shook, the flashlight beam dancing erratically across the creature's massive form. Then it stood up, on 2 legs. My mind reeled. This was no bear. Its proportions were all wrong. Long arms ending in massive clawed hands, powerfully muscled legs, and a head that seemed almost human-like, but distorted, with a protruding snout and pointed ears. It let out a low growl that vibrated through my entire body. "Oh, shit," I whispered, my voice barely audible even to myself. The creature took a step towards me, and I saw what it had been crouched over. The mangled carcass of a deer lay on the forest floor, its belly torn open, steam rising from its exposed entrails in the cool night air. My survival instincts finally kicked in. I stumbled backward, fumbling for my radio. "Base! Base! This is Nakamura. I need backup now." The radio crackled to life. "Kaito, what's your situation?" I didn't have time to respond. The creature let out another bone-chilling howl and charged. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush. Branches whipped at my face, roots threatened to trip me at every step. But I didn't dare slow down. I could hear it behind me, impossibly fast for something so large, its heavy footfalls shaking the ground. "There's something out here," I yelled into the radio as I ran. "Some kind of animal. It's huge. I need help." "Kaito, slow down. Where are you?" The voice on the radio sounded concerned now. I risked a glance over my shoulder and immediately wished I hadn't. The creature was gaining on me, its eyes glowing with predatory hunger. In the bouncing beam of my flashlight, I caught glimpses of its face, a nightmarish blend of wolf and man, with rows of gleaming teeth. "I don't know," I shouted into the radio. "Near Lookout Creek, heading east. Please, hurry." I veered sharply to the right, hoping to throw it off. My lungs burned and my legs felt like lead. I knew I couldn't keep this pace up for long. Suddenly, my foot caught on a root and I went down hard. The flashlight flew from my hand, spinning through the air before going dark as it hit the ground. I scrambled to my feet, but it was too late. A massive weight slammed into me from behind, knocking me face first into the dirt. Hot breath washed over my neck, reeking of blood and decay. I could feel its claws digging into my back, piercing through my jacket. This was it. I was going to die here, torn apart by some impossible creature in the depths of the forest. I squeezed my eyes shut, waiting for the killing blow. But it didn't come. Instead, I heard a low, rumbling sound, almost like sniffing. The creature was sniffing me. Slowly, carefully, I turned my head. In the faint starlight filtering through the trees, I could make out its massive silhouette. It had its head tilted, almost quizzically, as it continued to sniff at me. "Please," I whispered, not even sure what I was pleading for. To my utter astonishment, the creature backed off. It took a step away, then another. I rolled over, watching in disbelief as it retreated into the shadows of the forest. For a long moment, I just lay there, gasping for breath, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. Then slowly I pushed myself to my feet. My radio crackled. "Kaito, Kaito, do you copy? We're sending a team to your last known location. What's your status?" With shaking hands, I brought the radio to my mouth. I'm okay. It's gone." "What's gone, Kaito? What did you see?" I stared into the darkness where the creature had disappeared. What had I seen? My mind struggled to process it. It couldn't have been real. There had to be a rational explanation. I'm not sure," I said finally. "I think it was a bear. A really big bear. It's gone now. Stay where you are. We'll be there soon." I clicked off the radio and sank to the ground, my back against a tree. As the adrenaline faded, every muscle in my body began to ache. I touched my face, feeling the sting of cuts from the branches I'd run through. What had just happened? Had I imagined it all? But no, my shredded jacket and the deep scratches on my back were proof enough that something had attacked me. But what? And why had it let me go? I sat there in the dark, jumping at every sound, until I heard the welcome calls of the search team. As their flashlights appeared through the trees, I stood up on shaky legs. "Over here!" I called out. They rushed over, faces etched with concern. My supervisor, Dave, reached me first. "Jesus, Kaito, you look like hell. What happened out there?" I opened my mouth, then closed it again. How could I possibly explain what I'd seen? They'd think I was crazy. Hell, maybe I was crazy. I'm not sure," I said finally. "I heard a strange sound and went to investigate. I found a dead deer in a clearing. Then something chased me. It was dark. I couldn't see clearly. I thought it was a bear, but—" Dave put a hand on my shoulder. "It's okay, kid. You're safe now. Let's get you back to base and checked out." As they led me back through the forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see those glowing eyes in the darkness. Back at the ranger station, the medic cleaned and bandaged my cuts. My colleagues peppered me with questions, but I stuck to my vague story about a bear encounter. What else could I say? As the sun began to rise, casting a pale light through the windows, Dave came to check on me. "You did good out there, Kaito. First solo night patrol, and you handled a dangerous situation. Not everyone could have kept their cool like that." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. If only he knew how far from cool I'd been. "Take a few days off," Dave continued. "Get some rest. We'll do a thorough sweep of the area, see if we can find any sign of this bear." "Thanks," I managed to say. As I drove home, exhaustion weighing heavily on me, I couldn't stop thinking about those eyes, that face, the way it had sniffed me and then just left. I knew one thing for certain. I would never forget this night, and somehow I knew this wasn't the end of it. Whatever that creature was, wherever it had come from, I had a feeling our paths would cross again, and next time I'd be ready. Story 3. I knew we shouldn't have taken the trail the second we stepped off the marked path. The woods had that kind of stillness that crawls under your skin, like the trees were holding their breath, watching us. The air smelled thick with pine and damp earth, and the wind barely whispered through the branches. Tobias was a few steps ahead, his backpack bouncing with each stride, completely oblivious. "We're not supposed to be here," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's blocked off for a reason, you know." Tobias glanced back at me with that same cocky smirk he always had. "Elena, relax. It's just a shortcut. We'll be back on the main trail in no time." A shortcut, he called it, but I'd seen the warning signs nailed to the trees. Closed trail, danger. They weren't the flimsy, generic signs you'd see on regular paths. No, these were heavy, old, almost like they'd been there forever, half buried in moss and vines. But Tobias, being Tobias, shrugged it off like he always did. I sighed and kept moving, the uncomfortable itch between my shoulder blades getting worse. Something felt wrong. I didn't want to seem paranoid, but every step off the main trail made my stomach knot tighter. The trees here were different, thicker, older, their branches reaching out like twisted fingers. The light barely touched the ground anymore, and the further we went, the darker it got. "You're gonna owe me a drink after this," I muttered, trying to lighten the mood. Tobias chuckled, not slowing down. "If it saves us an hour of hiking, I'll buy you two." I didn't respond. My attention was drawn to the way the forest floor was changing. The dirt was softer here, more overgrown, like no one had walked this way in years. It felt forgotten, abandoned. Even the birds had gone quiet, and the only sound left was the crunch of leaves under our boots. After about 20 minutes, the trail narrowed so much that we were practically pushing through bushes and low-hanging branches. My legs ached from stepping over roots and uneven ground, and I could hear Tobias cursing under his breath every time he had to duck under a tree limb. "This doesn't feel right," I said, stopping to catch my breath. "We should turn back." "We're too far in now," he said, not even bothering to look back. "We'll hit the ridge soon. Trust me." But that was the problem. Tobias always assumed he knew better, and maybe he usually did. But right now, my instincts were screaming that we were in over our heads. There was no sign of any ridge, just an endless stretch of trees that seemed to close in tighter the further we went. Something snapped off to our right, a sharp, deliberate crack. I froze, whipping my head in the direction of the sound. "Did you hear that?" Tobias stopped, finally turning to look at me, his brow furrowing. "Yeah, probably just a deer." It didn't sound like a deer. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as I strained to listen. For a long moment, there was nothing. Silence so thick it felt like the forest itself was holding its breath. And then it came again, closer this time. A distinct crunch of leaves like something heavy was moving through the brush. I took a step back, my pulse quickening. "We should go back. Now." Tobias opened his mouth to argue, but then he heard it too. Another snap, followed by a low, almost guttural sound. Not quite human, not quite animal. His face paled slightly, and for the first time since we'd started this stupid detour, I saw doubt flicker in his eyes. Without another word, we turned and started retracing our steps, moving faster now, our breath coming in quick, sharp bursts. The trees blurred together as we pushed through, not caring about the branches scratching at our arms or the roots tripping us up. Every few steps, I'd glance behind me, convinced something was following us, just out of sight. And then we came to a dead stop. The trail we'd been following, the faint path we'd come in on, was gone. I looked around, panic rising in my chest. "Where the hell is it? This was the way we came, right?" Tobias cursed under his breath, spinning in a slow circle, scanning the forest. I don't know, it was here, I'm sure it was. The ground around us was undisturbed, no footprints, no sign of the trail we had just been on. It was like the forest had swallowed it up, erased any trace that we'd ever been there. "We're lost," I whispered, the words choking in my throat. "Don't say that," Tobias snapped, his voice tight with frustration. "We're not lost. We need to keep moving. We'll find it." But there was an edge of fear in his voice now. I could hear it, and that made everything worse. We pressed on, our pace frantic now, shoving through the undergrowth, trying to find any sign of the trail. But the more we moved, the more disoriented we became. The forest all looked the same. Endless trees, twisted roots, shadows that stretched long and menacing across the ground. And that sound, the one we'd heard earlier, it was following us. I could feel it. Every few minutes, another snap of a branch, another crunch of leaves, like something was keeping pace with us, just out of sight, just far enough to stay hidden. My hands shook as I gripped the straps of my backpack, my knuckles white. Tobias stopped suddenly, holding up a hand. "Wait. Do you hear that?" I strained my ears, heart pounding, and then I heard it, a faint voice, distant but unmistakable, calling out, soft at first but then louder. "Help!" I turned to Tobias, my eyes wide. "Someone's out here." He didn't respond, his face drawn tight as he listened. The voice came again, closer now, cutting through the stillness of the forest. "Help me." It sounded wrong, like someone was trying too hard to mimic a human voice, the inflection just slightly off. But at that moment the fear of being lost was stronger than any suspicion I had. We weren't alone out here. Someone else was lost too. Maybe they could help us find the way back. "Should we?" I started to ask, but Tobias was already moving toward the sound. "No!" I grabbed his arm. "Something's not right." He yanked his arm away, giving me a sharp look. "We can't leave someone out here. What if they're hurt?" Before I could protest, he took off toward the voice, his boots thudding against the forest floor. I cursed under my breath and followed, my gut screaming at me to stop, to turn back. The voice grew louder, echoing through the trees, pulling us deeper into the forest. But as we ran, something strange started happening. The trees began to look different, twisted almost. Their trunks were gnarled, blackened, like they had been scorched by fire. The air felt colder, heavy with a dampness that clung to my skin. We stopped suddenly at the edge of a small clearing. In the center stood a single massive tree, its bark dark and cracked, branches reaching up like skeletal arms, and sitting at the base of the tree was a figure, a person, a woman maybe, though it was hard to tell. She was hunched over, her back to us, her clothes tattered and dirty, her hair matted. But it was the way she was sitting, so still, so unnaturally still, that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. "Hey!" Tobias called out, stepping forward. "Are you okay?" The woman didn't move. I grabbed his arm again, my heart thudding against my ribs. "Tobias, don't!" But he ignored me, stepping closer. "Hey, do you need help?" That's when she moved, her head twisted, not turned, twisted, around to face us. Her eyes were wide, too wide, gleaming unnaturally in the fading light. Her mouth stretched into a grin, a grotesque, inhuman smile that sent ice shooting through my veins. Tobias froze, his breath catching in his throat. I could see it on his face. The moment he realized we'd made a terrible mistake, before either of us could react, she stood up, her movements jerky. Wrong. She took one step forward, and that's when I saw the hands, long, gnarled fingers with nails sharp as claws. "Run!" I whispered, my voice trembling. Tobias didn't need to be told twice. We bolted, crashing through the undergrowth, our breath coming in ragged gasps. The forest seemed to close in around us, branches clawing at our clothes, roots tripping us up as we ran. Behind us, I could hear the thing moving, fast. Impossibly fast, its twisted laughter echoing through the trees. I didn't look back. We didn't stop running until we broke through the trees and stumbled onto the main trail. Collapsing to the ground, gasping for breath, I dared to glance behind us. The forest was silent, but I knew it was still out there, watching us, waiting. We never took a shortcut again. Story 4. The first snap of a twig jolted me awake. I lay still, ears straining in the darkness. There it was again, the unmistakable sound of something moving around my tent. My heart began to race as I realized I wasn't alone out here in the wilderness. I'm Aisha Malik, a 28-year-old software engineer from Seattle. This solo camping trip was supposed to be my escape from the chaos of city life and the pressures of my job. Now, as I lay paralyzed with fear in my sleeping bag, I was beginning to regret my decision to find myself in the remote backcountry of Olympic National Park. Another snap, closer this time. Whatever was out there, it was getting bolder. I fumbled for my flashlight, my sweaty palms slipping on the smooth metal. As I clicked it on, a shadow darted across the wall of my tent. "Hello?" I called out, hating how my voice quavered. "Is someone there?" No response, just the rustle of movement outside. I sat up slowly, unzipping my sleeping bag as quietly as possible. My mind raced through the possibilities: a fellow hiker, a park ranger, or something far more dangerous. I needed to see what I was dealing with. With trembling hands, I reached for the tent zipper. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the stillness of the night. I paused, holding my breath, waiting to see if the noise had scared off my mysterious visitor. Instead, I heard a low growl. My blood ran cold. That was no human sound. Swallowing hard, I eased the tent flap open just enough to peer out. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the dense forest around my small campsite. At first, I saw nothing. Then, a flash of movement caught my eye. 2 pinpricks of light reflected my flashlight beam. Eyes, watching me. I gasped, jerking back instinctively. The eyes blinked, then began to move. As the creature stepped into the clearing, I finally got a good look at it. A coyote. Lean and hungry-looking, its ribs visible beneath its patchy fur. It stared at me, unafraid, its yellow eyes gleaming with an unsettling intelligence. "Go on! Get out of here!" I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. The coyote didn't budge. Instead, it took another step closer, its nose twitching as it scented the air. That's when I remembered the granola bar I'd eaten just before bed. The wrapper was still in my tent. Cursing my carelessness, I fumbled for my bear spray. As I did, a movement to my left caught my eye. Another coyote emerged from the underbrush, followed closely by a third. "Shit," I muttered. 1 coyote I could handle, but 3. This was bad. I weighed my options. My car was parked about 2 miles down the trail. I could make a run for it, but in the dark, with 3 predators on my tail. Not a chance. My best bet was to stand my ground and hope they'd lose interest. Slowly, I unzipped the tent further and began to ease my way out. The coyotes watched my every move, their bodies tense, ready to spring. I clutched the bear spray in one hand, my flashlight in the other, and tried to remember everything I'd read about wildlife encounters. "Hey!" I yelled, making myself as big as possible. "Get out of here!" The coyotes flinched at my shout, but didn't retreat. The first one, clearly the leader, took another step forward. Its lips curled back, revealing yellowed teeth. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. I'd always thought of coyotes as relatively harmless, more likely to run than fight, but the hungry look in their eyes told me these weren't your average suburban scavengers. "Back off!" I shouted again, waving my arms. "I'm warning you!" The lead coyote let out a low growl, and the other 2 fanned out, trying to flank me. I realized with growing horror that they were coordinating their attack. This wasn't just opportunistic scavenging. They were hunting me. In that moment, all my wilderness training flew out the window. Panic took over, and I did the one thing you're never supposed to do when faced with predators. I ran. Bursting out of the tent, I sprinted for the tree line. I could hear the coyotes behind me, their paws thudding against the ground as they gave chase. Branches whipped at my face as I crashed through the underbrush, my lungs burning with each gasping breath. I had no idea where I was going. In the darkness, every tree looked the same. I just knew I had to put distance between myself and those snapping jaws. A root caught my foot, and I went down hard. Pain shot through my ankle as I scrambled to get back up. The beam of my flashlight, miraculously still in my grip, bounced wildly across the forest floor. That's when I saw it, a large fallen tree, its trunk easily 4 feet in diameter. Without thinking, I dove for it, rolling underneath into the small space between the log and the ground. Not a moment too soon. I heard the coyotes skid to a stop just on the other side of the log. Their claws scrabbled at the bark as they tried to reach me. I pressed myself as far back as I could, my heart pounding so hard I was sure they could hear it. "Go away," I whispered, more a prayer than a command. "Please, just go away." For what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the coyotes circled my hiding spot. I could hear them sniffing, searching for a way to get at me. Occasionally one would let out a frustrated whine or growl. I knew I couldn't stay here forever. Eventually, they'd find a way in, or I'd have to make a run for it. But for now, this log was my lifeline. As I lay there, trying to control my panicked breathing, my mind drifted to how I'd ended up in this situation. The stress of my job, the breakup with my longtime girlfriend, the feeling that I was losing touch with who I really was, it had all led me to this ill-advised solo trip. Now, I'd give anything to be back in my cramped Seattle apartment, surrounded by the comforting hum of city life. A particularly loud growl snapped me back to reality. I realized the coyotes' movements had changed. They seemed more agitated, moving faster around the log. What had set them off? Then I heard it, a low, rumbling sound in the distance. Thunder? No, an engine. Hope surged through me. Someone was driving nearby, probably on the Forest Service road that led to the trailhead. If I could just get their attention. But how? I was easily a quarter-mile from the road, maybe more. There was no way they'd hear me shouting from here. And if I left the safety of my log, the coyotes would be on me in seconds. The sound of the engine grew louder, then began to fade. They were passing by. "No!" I whispered. "No, no, no! Come back!" In desperation, I did the only thing I could think of. I started banging my flashlight against the log as hard as I could. The hollow trunk amplified the sound, creating a booming rhythm that echoed through the forest. The coyotes yelped in surprise, momentarily retreating. I kept banging, putting every ounce of strength into each hit. My palm stung, and I could feel splinters digging into my skin, but I didn't stop. "Please," I thought, "please hear me." The engine sound had faded to almost nothing. Then, miraculously, it grew louder again. They were coming back. Renewed hope gave me a surge of energy. I banged harder, faster, ignoring the pain in my hand. "Here!" I screamed. "I'm over here!" A new sound joined the mix, barking, but not from the coyotes. This was deeper, more aggressive, dog barking. Flashlight beams cut through the trees, accompanied by shouts. "Hello? Is someone there?" "Yes!" I yelled, my voice cracking with relief. "Over here! Help!" I heard footsteps crashing through the underbrush, coming closer. The coyotes' growls turned to whimpers, and I heard them retreating into the forest. A face appeared at the end of the log, a man with a graying beard and a park ranger hat. "Good Lord," he said, shining his light on me. "Are you all right?" I nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. As the ranger helped me out from under the log, I saw his partner, a younger woman holding the leash of a large German shepherd. "What happened?" the female ranger asked, her eyes wide as she took in my disheveled appearance. "Coyotes," I managed to say. "3 of them. They chased me." The male ranger whistled low. "You're lucky we heard you. We were just finishing up a late patrol when we thought we heard something strange." As the adrenaline began to fade, the events of the night crashed over me. To my embarrassment, I felt tears welling up in my eyes. "Thank you," I whispered. "Thank you so much." The female ranger put a comforting hand on my shoulder. "It's okay. You're safe now. Let's get you back to the station and checked out." As they led me through the forest, the German shepherd trotting alertly at our side, I couldn't help but cast nervous glances into the darkness. But the coyotes were gone, driven off by the larger predators, both canine and human. Later, as I sat wrapped in a shock blanket in the warmth of the ranger station, sipping hot tea, I reflected on the night's events. I had come to the wilderness seeking clarity, a reconnection with nature. Instead, I'd found terror and a stark reminder of my own vulnerability. But I'd also found something else, a newfound appreciation for the raw power of the natural world and for the people who dedicated their lives to protecting both it and those who ventured into it. As I gave my statement to the rangers, I made a silent promise to myself. I would return to these woods one day, but next time I'd be better prepared, and I definitely wouldn't be alone. The wilderness had tested me, pushed me to my limits, and though it had been terrifying, I realized I had come out stronger on the other side. Maybe, in a way, I had found what I was looking for after all. Story 5. I didn't see it at first, but I felt it. Working alone in the middle of nowhere does that to you after a while. You get this strange sixth sense for when something's off. I'd been stationed in the fire lookout tower at Black Ridge for 6 weeks. My only company the trees and the occasional crackle of the radio. But the moment I woke up that morning, something about the air felt different, heavier. It was just a normal shift, or at least it should have been. The sky was clear, a perfect blue that stretched on forever, and the forest below was calm, still. But there was this nagging feeling in my gut, like I was being watched. I brushed it off. Being up in a tower, hundreds of feet off the ground, could mess with your mind. The isolation, the quiet, it played tricks on you. You start imagining things. Still, I found myself constantly glancing over my shoulder that morning, peering through the tiny windows of the tower, scanning the tree line far below. Nothing, just trees swaying in the wind. I shook my head, grabbing the binoculars off the table to do my usual scan. The ridge to the north caught my attention first, a jagged line of rock and trees that cut across the horizon. I focused on it, watching the way the sunlight danced across the tops of the pines, the shadows creeping over the rocks. And that's when I saw it. A glint, just for a second, like sunlight bouncing off glass or metal. I adjusted the binoculars, focusing harder, but whatever it was gone. I frowned, lowering the binoculars. "What the hell?" I muttered to myself, my breath fogging up the glass for a second. I turned back to my logbook, trying to shake the feeling, but the itch between my shoulders stayed. I knew I'd seen something. Maybe it was just a reflection off a rock. "Probably nothing," I muttered again. "I'm overthinking it." But by noon, I couldn't ignore it anymore. There was this constant, unsettling feeling in the pit of my stomach. Every time I stepped out onto the deck of the tower, I swore I could feel eyes on me. It was ridiculous, I knew that, but the feeling wouldn't go away. I radioed into Walt, just to have something to do, something to ground me. "Walt, you there?" Static crackled for a second before his gruff voice came through. "Yeah, what's up, Martin? Everything quiet on your end?" "Quiet as a tomb. Why?" I hesitated, my eyes drifting back to the ridge. "I don't know. Just got a weird feeling up here today. Saw something earlier, up on the north ridge. Thought it might have been a reflection or something." Walt chuckled. "Reflection? You sure you're not getting cabin fever up there, buddy?" I forced a laugh. "Probably. Anyway, figured I'd check in." "Yeah, well, keep your eyes peeled. Last thing we need is some idiot wandering off trail and breaking an ankle out there. You know how these tourists get." "Copy that," I said, trying to sound casual. I clicked off the radio and stared back out at the ridge. The sun was starting to sink lower, casting long shadows across the landscape. That feeling, like something was watching me, wasn't going away. If anything, it was getting stronger. By the time dusk rolled around, I was jumpy as hell. Every creak of the tower, every gust of wind through the trees below, had me on edge. I kept pacing, glancing out at the ridge every few minutes, but whatever I'd seen earlier hadn't shown up again. Then, just as the last of the sunlight disappeared behind the mountains, I heard it. A single deliberate knock on the wood outside the tower. I froze. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't the tower settling, it was too deliberate, slow, like someone had just knocked on the support beam right beneath me. "Hello?" I called out, my voice hoarse, cracking slightly. Nothing. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to move toward the door. I stepped outside onto the narrow deck, the cool night air hitting my face. The forest below was dark, the trees nothing more than black shapes against the horizon. I held my breath, straining to listen. Knock, knock. This time it was closer, not underneath the tower, but from the ridge. I swung my binoculars back up to my eyes, scanning the darkness. At first I saw nothing, just endless trees and the silhouette of the ridge in the distance. But then, there it was again, that glint. This time it wasn't a reflection. It was eyes. Two glinting, reflective eyes, just barely visible in the shadows, staring right back at me from the top of the ridge. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. They were watching me. No, it was watching me. I fumbled for the radio. My hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped it. Walt, you there? Martin, you okay? There's someone out there, I whispered, my voice barely audible even to myself. On the ridge, watching me. The radio was silent for a moment. Too long. I pressed it again, almost frantic. Walt, did you hear me? Yeah, I heard you. Look, it's probably nothing. Could be an animal, maybe a trick of the light. You've been up there for a while now, just don't go jumping to conclusions, all right? I didn't respond. My eyes were still locked on the ridge. The glinting eyes hadn't moved. They were still there, staring right at me. Martin, you hear me? I clicked the radio. I hear you. But I wasn't convinced. I stepped back inside the tower, bolting the door behind me, though it felt ridiculous. Like that flimsy piece of wood would stop whatever was out there. I tried to shake it off, busying myself with the radio logs, but the feeling stayed. Deep down, I knew I wasn't alone. I forced myself to sit down at the small table in the center of the room, staring at the radio. Part of me wanted to call Walt back, tell him to send someone out here, but I knew how that would sound. Like I was losing it. Hours passed. The night dragged on, the air in the tower growing stale, thick with my own fear. Every so often I'd glance out the windows, but the eyes were gone. The ridge was quiet now, just a shadow in the distance. Finally, I forced myself to lie down, though sleep felt impossible. I don't know when I dozed off, but something woke me. A sound, a voice, low, gravelly, whispering from outside the tower. Martin! I bolted upright, heart racing. I grabbed my flashlight, sweeping it across the room, as if someone could have snuck inside while I slept. Nothing. But the whisper came again, closer this time, like it was just outside the door. Martin! I held my breath, stepping closer to the door, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The voice was too low to be human, too distorted. Who's there? I called out, my voice shaky. Who the hell's out there? The silence that followed was thick, oppressive. But then, through the crack under the door, I saw it. A shadow. Something tall, impossibly tall, standing just on the other side. I stumbled back, my hand flying to the radio, hitting the button hard. Walt! Walt, you there? Static. Then, Martin? What's going on? You okay? There's something out here, I whispered, barely able to get the words out. It's right outside the door. It knows my name. I waited for Walt's response, but there was only silence. Then a heavy thud hit the door, shaking the frame. Thud, thud. I scrambled to the corner of the room, the flashlight beam bouncing wildly across the walls. My heart was in my throat, my breaths coming in sharp, shallow gasps. "Walt!" I screamed into the radio, my voice cracking. "I need help! It's—" But before I could finish, the door creaked open. Slowly. I stared, frozen in place as the darkness outside crept into the room. My flashlight flickered, the beam barely cutting through the shadows. And then it stepped inside. The thing, whatever it was, towered over me, its face hidden in the dark, but I could feel its eyes on me. Those same eyes I'd seen on the ridge, glinting in the night. It smiled, or at least I thought it did. And then it spoke again, in that same low, gravelly voice. "Martin." I don't remember much after that. When Walt and the team found me the next morning, I was sitting in the corner of the tower, clutching the radio like it was a lifeline, staring at the door. It was wide open, and whatever had been watching me, gone. But I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't alone out there. Not anymore. Story 6. I've captured countless images of wildlife in my career, but nothing could have prepared me for what I saw through my lens that day. It was an encounter that would challenge everything I thought I knew about the natural world and leave me questioning my own sanity. My name is Dmitry Volkov, and I'm a 42-year-old wildlife photographer from St. Petersburg, Russia. I've spent the last 2 decades traveling the globe, documenting Earth's most elusive creatures. But it was here, in the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest, that I encountered something that defied explanation. The day started like any other on this assignment. I'd been commissioned by National Geographic to capture images of the region's diverse wildlife, with a particular focus on the elusive mountain lions that roamed these parts. I'd set up my blind in a towering Douglas fir, my camera equipment secured to the sturdy branches around me. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the canopy, I settled in for a long day of waiting. Patience is a wildlife photographer's greatest asset, and I'd honed mine to a fine edge over the years. Hours passed. The forest came alive with the day's activities, birds flitting from branch to branch, squirrels chattering as they foraged for food. I captured a few shots, but nothing extraordinary. The big cats remained stubbornly out of sight. It was late afternoon when everything changed. The forest had grown eerily quiet, the usual symphony of wildlife sounds suddenly muted. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Every instinct I'd developed over years in the wild screamed that something was wrong. I raised my camera, scanning the forest floor through my telephoto lens. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. A large, dark shape moved between the trees, walking on 2 legs. My heart raced as I adjusted my focus. This was no bear. Its proportions were all wrong. It moved with an odd, loping gait, its arms swinging at its sides. As it came into clear view, I nearly dropped my camera in shock. The creature was easily 7 feet tall, covered in thick, matted fur. Its body was powerfully built, with broad shoulders and long arms that nearly reached its knees. But it was the face that truly chilled me, a bizarre mix of ursine and human features, with a pronounced snout and small, intelligent eyes. My finger instinctively pressed the shutter button, capturing a rapid series of shots. The sound, barely audible to human ears, caused the creature to pause. It turned its head, seeming to look directly at me. For a moment, our eyes met through the lens. I felt a jolt of recognition, a spark of intelligence in its gaze that was undeniably self-aware. This was no mere animal. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the creature lumbered out of view, disappearing into the thick underbrush. I sat in my perch, trembling, my mind struggling to process what I'd just witnessed. It couldn't be real. There had to be a logical explanation. A man in a suit? Some undiscovered species of primate? Or had the long hours and solitude finally caused me to crack? With shaking hands, I reviewed the images on my camera's display. There it was, in crisp digital clarity, the impossible creature I'd just seen. My breath caught in my throat as I zoomed in on its face, those eerily intelligent eyes staring back at me. I needed to get down, to return to civilization and share what I'd discovered. But as I began to pack up my gear, a new sound froze me in place. A low, pained growl echoed through the forest, followed by the crash of underbrush. Against every instinct of self-preservation, I found myself drawn to investigate. Carefully, I descended from my perch, my camera clutched tightly to my chest. I moved as quietly as I could through the forest, following the sounds of distress. As I approached a small clearing, I saw it again. The creature was hunched over, clearly in pain. That's when I noticed the blood matting its fur, a deep gash visible on its side. It had been injured, perhaps by a run-in with a real bear or mountain lion. I must have made a sound because suddenly its head snapped up, those intelligent eyes locking onto me. We stood there, frozen, barely 20 feet apart. I could hear its labored breathing, see the rise and fall of its massive chest. Slowly, I raised my camera. The creature watched me warily, but didn't move. I took a few shots, the click of the shutter unnaturally loud in the tense silence. "It's okay," I found myself saying, my voice barely above a whisper. "I won't hurt you." The creature tilted its head, almost as if it understood. Then, to my utter amazement, it took a halting step towards me. I held my ground, though every fibre of my being screamed at me to run. As it drew closer, I could smell its musky odor, a mix of wet fur and something undefinably wild. Its eyes never left mine, filled with a mixture of pain and curiosity. When it was barely 10 feet away, it suddenly stumbled, its injury clearly taking its toll. Without thinking, I stepped forward to help. The moment I moved, the spell was broken. The creature let out a startled growl and turned, crashing back into the underbrush with surprising speed despite its wound. I stood there, heart pounding, as the sound of its retreat faded into the distance. Part of me wanted to follow, to see where it went, to unravel this mystery. But the rational part of my brain finally kicked in, reminding me of the danger. As twilight began to settle over the forest, I made my way back to my campsite in a daze. My hands shook as I lit my camp stove, my mind replaying the encounter over and over. I knew what I'd seen, what I'd captured on camera. But I also knew the world wasn't ready for this discovery. Who would believe me? Even with the photos, I'd be labeled a hoaxer at best, insane at worst. And if people did believe, what then? Would this creature be hunted, studied, its habitat destroyed by curiosity seekers and scientists alike? As I sipped my coffee, staring into the gathering darkness of the forest, I came to a decision. The world wasn't ready for this truth. Not yet. With a heavy heart, I pulled out my camera's memory card. I held it up, this tiny piece of plastic that contained evidence that could rewrite our understanding of the natural world. Then, with a deep breath, I snapped it in half. The loss of those images felt like a physical pain, but I knew it was the right choice. Some mysteries, I realized, were meant to remain unsolved. Some wonders of nature were best left undiscovered. As I settled into my tent that night, my dreams were filled with images of the creature. But now, instead of fear, I felt a strange sense of kinship. We were both solitary beings, navigating a world that didn't fully understand us. In the days that followed, I continued my assignment as if nothing had happened. I captured stunning images of bears, elk, and even a few glimpses of the mountain lions I'd been sent to photograph. But none of these compared to what I'd seen in that clearing. When I returned to civilization, I threw myself into my work with renewed vigor. But I never forgot that day in the forest. Sometimes, on sleepless nights, I find myself wondering about the creature. Did it survive its injury? Were there others like it out there? I've never returned to that specific location, though I've been tempted many times. Part of me hopes to one day encounter the creature again, to confirm that it wasn't just a product of an overactive imagination or a momentary lapse in sanity. But a larger part of me is content with the mystery, with the knowledge that there are still wonders in this world beyond our understanding. Years have passed, and I've never spoken of what I saw to anyone. But sometimes, when I'm in the wilderness with my camera, I feel a presence watching me from just beyond the trees, and I smile, knowing that there are still secrets out there, waiting to be discovered by those brave enough or foolish enough to look. As for me, I'm content with the memory of those intelligent eyes, that moment of connection with something beyond our narrow definition of the possible. It's a reminder that the world is vaster and more mysterious than we can imagine, and that some truths are best left unspoken, preserved in the quiet corners of our hearts and minds. Story 7. The fog rolled in faster than we expected. One moment the valley was clear, the sunset casting long shadows across the hills, and the next a thick wall of mist crept over the trees, swallowing everything in its path. I felt a chill crawl up my spine, even though it wasn't cold yet. Beside me, Sophia was fussing with the tent, oblivious to the way the fog moved, almost like it had a purpose. "We should have camped higher up," I muttered, more to myself than to her, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling. Sophia glanced up, rolling her eyes. "Seriously, Naomi, we're fine. It's just fog. Besides, the creek's right here, easy access to water. You're being paranoid again." I wanted to argue, but I bit my tongue. Maybe I was being paranoid. After all, we'd camped in this valley before and nothing bad had ever happened. But tonight felt off. The fog wasn't just thick, it was suffocating, pressing in on us from all sides, making it hard to tell where the trees ended and the sky began. I glanced back up at the ridge, but the view had disappeared. The mountains were gone, swallowed by the mist. The only thing I could see was the faint outline of trees, and even they looked like shadows. "I'm going to gather more wood," I said, "just for something to do, something to distract me from the unease creeping under my skin." "Take the flashlight," Sophia called, not even looking up from the tent. I grabbed it and headed into the trees, the beam cutting a narrow path through the fog. The forest was quiet, too quiet. I could barely hear the creek now, just the occasional gurgle of water in the distance. No birds, no insects, just the soft crunch of my boots on the ground and the oppressive silence all around. I crouched down to pick up a few stray branches, trying to push the growing tension out of my mind. It's just fog. We're fine. Stop overthinking. But then, as I stood up, I heard something. A faint rustling like footsteps, somewhere deeper in the trees. My breath caught, and I froze, listening. Probably just an animal. The rational part of my brain was screaming at me to calm down, to stop being so damn paranoid, but my instincts were firing off alarms. The rustling stopped, and for a long moment there was nothing but the fog swirling around me. Then came the snap of a twig. Close, too close. I whipped the flashlight toward the sound, the beam cutting through the mist, but there was nothing there, just trees and fog, stretching on endlessly. I swallowed hard, backing up a step. "Sophia," I called out, my voice sounding too small in the thick air. No response. "Sophia, come on. This isn't funny." Still nothing. I backed up another step, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew Sophia liked to mess with me sometimes, but this wasn't her style. She wasn't the type to play creepy pranks, especially not out here. I turned on my heel and hurried back toward the camp, clutching the firewood tightly against my chest like it was some kind of protection. When I got back, the campfire was still burning low, the tent half set up, but Sophia wasn't there. "Sophia!" I called out again, louder this time. Nothing. I dropped the wood next to the fire and grabbed my phone, squinting at the screen. No signal, of course. Typical. I turned back toward the trees, my flashlight cutting through the fog again. "Sophia, stop messing around. Where are you?" My voice echoed back to me, hollow and empty. The fog seemed to absorb everything else, turning the world around me into a muted blur of grey. A faint rustling came from behind the trees again, and my heart lurched. I took a step forward, forcing myself to keep moving, even though every instinct was screaming at me to stay put, to get back to the fire and wait for her. But something was pulling me forward, the same way the fog had pulled itself over the valley. The rustling grew louder, followed by a low, almost rhythmic sound, like heavy breathing. I swung the flashlight wildly, trying to see through the fog. My pulse hammered in my ears, drowning out the soft sound of the creek that had been comforting just moments ago. There was movement, faint and shadowy, just beyond the beam of light. "Sophia, I swear to God." But as I stepped closer, I saw her. She was standing just beyond the trees, her back to me, completely still. Her arms hung loosely by her sides, her hair tangled and damp from the mist. Relief rushed through me, mixing with frustration. "Sophia, what the hell are you doing? You scared the crap out of me." She didn't move. I swallowed, the knot of tension tightening in my stomach. "Sophia." No answer. The fog swirled around her, thick and unnatural, clinging to her clothes. The longer I stared, the more I realized something wasn't right. She wasn't standing in a normal way. Her posture was off, her head tilted at an awkward angle, like she was listening for something. "Hey!" I called again, stepping closer, the beam of my flashlight bouncing unsteadily. "Sophia, come on! What are you doing?" Still, she didn't move, didn't acknowledge me at all. The pit in my stomach grew heavier, dread wrapping itself around my chest like a vice. Something about the way she was standing, the way the fog seemed to pool around her legs. It wasn't right. My skin prickled, every nerve on edge. I took another step forward, my voice trembling. "Sophia." Finally she moved. Slowly, so slowly her head turned toward me, but it wasn't Sophia's face that looked back at me. The breath caught in my throat as the flashlight beam hit her eyes that were too wide, too dark, too empty. Her face, no, not her face, not Sophia's, twisted into a grotesque smile, lips stretching too far, showing too many teeth. I stumbled back, my mind screaming at me to run, to get the hell out of there, but my legs felt like lead. The thing wearing Sophia's body took a slow, deliberate step forward, that awful smile never fading. "Naomi," it whispered, the voice distorted, too deep, too wrong. I gasped, choking on the air, the fog thickening around me, pressing down like a weight on my chest. My hands shook as I fumbled for the knife in my pack, but my fingers were numb, useless. "Run," the voice said again, this time clearer, more insistent. But it wasn't coming from the thing in front of me. It was coming from somewhere else, somewhere far behind me. I turned on instinct, my feet finally responding, and bolted back toward the camp, the fog swallowing everything around me. My legs burned as I pushed through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I stumbled back into the campsite, the fire still flickering weakly, casting long, dancing shadows across the trees. I collapsed to my knees, heart pounding, my eyes darting around the clearing. "Sophia?" I whispered, but my voice was hoarse, barely a sound. And then I saw her, the real Sophia, lying next to the tent, unconscious but breathing, her clothes damp from the mist. I scrambled over to her, shaking her shoulder. "Sophia! Sophia, wake up!" She groaned softly, her eyelids fluttering open. She looked disoriented, confused. "Naomi? What happened? You were—" I stopped, swallowing hard. How could I explain what I'd seen? How could I make sense of it myself? "I don't know," I muttered, my voice shaking. "You were gone. I thought—" Her brow furrowed as she sat up, wincing. I don't remember leaving the tent. I don't know, everything's fuzzy. I stared at her, my heart still racing. It was her, the real her. But whatever had been in the woods, whatever had worn her face, it was still out there. "We need to go," I said, my voice firmer this time. "Now." Sophia blinked at me, still groggy. "What are you talking about? It's the middle of the night. We can't hike back in this fog." "I don't care," I snapped, already packing up the gear. "We're leaving. I'm not staying here." Something in my voice must have convinced her, because she didn't argue. She just nodded and started helping me, her movements sluggish but determined. As we packed up the last of our things, I glanced back toward the trees, the fog still swirling, thick and heavy. Somewhere out there, just beyond the reach of the firelight, I could feel it watching us, waiting. We left the valley as fast as we could, not looking back. The fog followed us all the way up the trail, but by the time we reached the main road, it had lifted. We never spoke about it again. Some things, I guess, are better left buried in the mist. Story 8. It started with my name. I was miles into the wilderness, the air crisp with the scent of pine and earth, my boots sinking into the soft dirt beneath me. There wasn't a soul around for miles, or at least there shouldn't have been. Then, somewhere far behind me, I heard it. Someone calling my name. "Logan!" I froze. The voice was faint, distant, almost swallowed by the rustling of the wind through the trees. At first, I thought I had imagined it. After all, there was no reason anyone should be out here this deep in the woods. The nearest trailhead was an hour's hike back, and I hadn't seen another person all day. I waited, listening, but there was nothing, just the whisper of leaves and the distant gurgle of the creek winding through the valley. I shook my head, muttering to myself, "Get a grip, Logan. You're hearing things." It had been a long day of hiking, and I was probably just tired, my mind playing tricks on me. The woods had a way of doing that, making you think you weren't alone when you knew deep down that you were. But as I started walking again, I couldn't shake the feeling. That voice, it was too clear, too real to be nothing, and worse, it knew my name. A few minutes later, it came again. "Logan." This time, it was closer. I stopped in my tracks, my heart hammering in my chest. I turned, scanning the trees behind me, but there was nothing. Just the same stretch of forest, the same dense undergrowth. No one, but I had heard it, clear as day. How does someone know my name? I pressed my lips together, trying to stay calm, but the knot in my stomach was tightening. There wasn't supposed to be anyone out here. I was days into the wilderness, far from any campground or main trail. Even if someone had followed me, why would they stay hidden? Why not just show themselves? My pulse quickened, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I'd hiked these woods for years, but I'd never felt like this before. This overwhelming sense of being watched, stalked. "Logan." There it was again. This time, the voice was unmistakable. Low, deliberate, almost playful, like someone was teasing me, daring me to come closer. I swallowed hard, gripping my trekking pole tighter. "Who's there?" Nothing. I took a deep breath, trying to slow my racing heart. "This isn't funny. If you're messing with me, just come out." Silence. My eyes darted from tree to tree, scanning the shadows, searching for any sign of movement. But the forest was still, unnaturally still, as if the very trees were holding their breath. And that's when I realized it. The birds had stopped singing, the insects had gone quiet. The usual hum of the forest, the background noise that should have been comforting, was gone. The only sound left was the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze, and my name echoing faintly through the trees. "Logan!" I clenched my jaw, my skin crawling. This wasn't right. I didn't know what was out there, but I knew one thing for sure. I needed to get the hell out of here. I turned, quickening my pace down the narrow trail. My feet moved faster than they should have for this terrain, tripping over roots and rocks, but I didn't care. I just needed to keep moving, to put distance between myself and whatever was calling my name. The sound of my breath echoed in my ears, my chest tightening with every step. But the voice kept following me. "Logan!" I swore under my breath, my eyes darting around, trying to catch a glimpse of anything moving in the woods. But there was nothing. Just that damned voice, always just far enough away to make me question if it was real. I pulled out my map, my hands shaking as I tried to figure out exactly where I was. The trail twisted through the valley, and if I kept following it, I'd eventually hit the old ranger station. It was abandoned now, but maybe, just maybe, I could find some shelter there. At least I'd have walls around me, something to keep the voice out. The voice that was still calling my name. I pushed forward, the trail narrowing as the underbrush thickened. The trees seemed to close in around me, the fog starting to roll in from the valley, thick and suffocating. The light was fading fast, the sun dipping below the horizon, and soon I'd be left in the dark, with only my headlamp to guide me. "Logan!" I couldn't take it anymore. I whipped around, my pulse roaring in my ears. "Who the hell are you? What do you want?" No answer. But I could feel it now. Whatever it wasn't far. My eyes scanned the tree line, and for the briefest moment I thought I saw something, a shadow low to the ground, slipping between the trees. Something that moved too quickly, too fluidly, to be human. I turned back and ran. My legs burned as I sprinted down the trail, branches whipping at my arms, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't care where the trail led anymore, as long as it was away from that voice, away from whatever was following me. But it was fast, faster than me. I could hear it now, the soft thud of footsteps behind me, closing in. My name, no longer a whisper but a growl, low and menacing. "Logan!" I stumbled, catching myself on a tree, my heart slamming against my ribs. I looked back, the fog swirling thick around the trees, and for a split second I saw it. Eyes. Glowing in the darkness, watching me, narrowing as they locked onto mine. My stomach twisted with fear. I had to keep moving. I had to get out of here. I pushed forward, my muscles screaming in protest, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop, not with those eyes on me. Finally, after what felt like hours, I saw it, the old ranger station, a small, dilapidated building, half hidden by the trees, the windows shattered, the wood rotting. But it didn't matter. It was my only chance. I bolted for the door, throwing myself inside and slamming it shut behind me. I pressed my back against the wood, my chest heaving, my entire body trembling with exhaustion and fear. Silence. For the first time in what felt like hours, there was silence. No voice, no footsteps, just the sound of my ragged breathing and the wind rattling the broken windows. I sank to the floor, burying my face in my hands. I didn't know what the hell was out there, but I was safe, for now. But then slowly I heard it again. Tap, tap. My blood turned to ice. I looked up, my heart pounding in my chest. The door. Something was tapping on the door, softly, deliberately. I scrambled to my feet, backing away, my eyes locked on the wooden door. The tapping continued, slow and steady, like whatever was out there was waiting, toying with me. Then came the voice, low and guttural, seeping through the cracks in the wood. "Logan!" I pressed my hands over my ears, squeezing my eyes shut. This isn't real, this can't be real, but it was real. It was out there. It knew my name, and it wasn't going to stop. Tap, tap. I opened my eyes, my heart slamming against my ribs. The door rattled in its frame, as if something was pushing against it, testing it. I backed up until I hit the far wall, my breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps. There was no way out, no other door, no windows big enough to climb through, and the voice was getting louder. "Logan!" I couldn't think. My mind raced, desperate for an answer, a way out, but there was nothing. Just the voice, the tapping, the relentless pressure building inside me. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the tapping stopped. The voice fell silent. I held my breath. my pulse thudding in my ears. For a long, agonizing moment there was nothing but silence. And then, slowly, the door creaked open. I didn't move. I couldn't. My legs felt like stone, my body frozen in place as the door swung wide, revealing nothing but darkness beyond, and those eyes, glowing, watching me from the trees, waiting. The voice came again, low and mocking. "Logan!" I bolted for the door, my scream echoing in the night. They found me the next morning, wandering along the road, half-crazed, mumbling about voices in the woods. No one believed me, but I know what I heard, what I saw. It knew my name, and it's still out there. Story 9. The first footprint was so large I thought it must be a mistake. But as I followed the trail deeper into the forest, my excitement grew with each massive impression in the mud. Could this be it? The evidence I'd been searching for my entire career? My name is Mei Chen, and I'm a cryptozoologist. Most people would call me a monster hunter, but I prefer to think of myself as a seeker of undiscovered truths. For the past 15 years, I've scoured the globe for evidence of creatures that mainstream science refuses to acknowledge. And now, here in the remote wilderness of the Pacific Northwest, I might have stumbled upon the holy grail of cryptids, Bigfoot. I knelt to examine the latest print, my heart racing. It was nearly 18 inches long, with distinct toe impressions. No known animal in these parts could leave a track like this. I pulled out my camera, carefully photographing the print from multiple angles before taking measurements. As I stood, wiping the mud from my knees, a twig snapped somewhere in the dense forest behind me. I whirled around, scanning the trees. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding small in the vast wilderness. No response, just the whisper of wind through the pines and the distant call of a bird. I shook off the feeling of being watched and turned back to the trail. The prints led deeper into the forest, away from the hiking path I'd started on this morning. I knew I should turn back. I was already farther from my camp than I'd planned to go today. But the lure of discovery was too strong. "Just a little further," I muttered to myself, adjusting my backpack and following the trail. The forest grew denser as I walked, the towering trees blocking out more and more of the afternoon sun. The air grew cooler, heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, suppressing a shiver that had nothing to do with the temperature. After about an hour of careful tracking, the footprints led me to a small clearing. I froze at the edge of the trees, my breath catching in my throat. There, in the center of the clearing, was a crude structure made of broken branches and leaves. It looked like a massive nest, or perhaps a rudimentary shelter. "Oh my God," I whispered, fumbling for my camera. This was unprecedented. In all my years of research, I'd never seen anything like this outside of questionable YouTube videos and blurry photographs on conspiracy websites. As I approached the structure, my scientific mind battled with my growing excitement. There had to be a logical explanation for this. Perhaps it was an art installation, or the remnants of an old hunter's blind. But deep down, I knew this was different. The construction was too intricate, too purposeful to be the work of wind or animals. I circled the structure, documenting every detail. That's when I noticed something odd about the ground around it. The forest floor was covered in a thick layer of pine needles and leaves, but in a rough circle around the shelter, the ground was eerily bare, as if something large had repeatedly walked around it. A branch cracked loudly behind me, and I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaking slightly. Silence. Then, a rustling in the underbrush about 50 yards away. I squinted, trying to make out any movement in the deepening shadows of the forest. For a moment, I thought I saw a large, dark shape moving between the trees, but when I blinked, it was gone. My palms were sweaty as I gripped my camera. "This is Dr. Mei Chen," I said aloud, as much to calm myself as to document the moment. I'm at the site of a possible Sasquatch shelter. There appears to be movement in the surrounding forest, but I can't confirm visual contact at this time. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. This was what I'd been preparing for my entire career. If there really was a Bigfoot out there, I needed to keep my wits about me. As the light faded, I knew I needed to make a decision. It wasn't safe to be out here after dark, especially alone. But the thought of leaving this site, of potentially missing my chance at the discovery of a lifetime, was agonizing. In the end, self-preservation won out. I'd come back tomorrow, better prepared, and with more daylight. I took a few final photographs and reluctantly began to retrace my steps. That's when I saw it. Half hidden under a fallen log at the edge of the clearing was a tuft of coarse, dark hair. My hands trembled as I carefully collected the sample, placing it in a small evidence bag. As I stood up, a low, rumbling sound echoed through the forest. It wasn't quite a growl, not quite a moan, but something in between, and it was close. I ran. Branches whipped at my face as I crashed through the underbrush, my heart pounding in my ears. I could hear something moving through the forest behind me, keeping pace effortlessly. Whatever it was big, and it was fast. I burst out of the trees onto the hiking trail, gasping for breath. The sounds of pursuit faded, but I didn't slow down until I reached my campsite. I collapsed onto the ground, my legs shaking too much to hold me up. As my breathing slowly returned to normal, I tried to make sense of what had just happened. Had I really found evidence of Bigfoot? Or had my desperation for discovery caused me to misinterpret perfectly explainable phenomena? I pulled out the evidence bag with the hair sample, examining it closely in the fading light. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before, thicker than human hair, but finer than any known ape species. My scientific mind raced with the possibilities. That night, as I huddled in my tent, listening to the sounds of the forest, sleep eluded me. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves had me sitting up, straining my ears. Was it out there, watching me even now? Morning came with a thick blanket of fog, giving the forest an ethereal, almost menacing quality. I packed up my gear quickly, eager to return to the clearing and continue my investigation. But as I hiked back along the trail, something felt off. The forest seemed quieter than it should be, the usual morning chorus of birds noticeably absent. An uneasy feeling settled in the pit of my stomach. When I reached the spot where I'd first seen the footprints yesterday, I stopped short. The trail of prints was gone, smoothed over as if they'd never existed. I frantically searched the area, but there was no sign of the massive impressions I'd so carefully documented. With growing dread, I pushed on towards the clearing. But where yesterday there had been a crude shelter, today there was nothing but undisturbed forest floor, no bare patch of earth, no carefully constructed nest of branches. It was as if the entire scene had been erased. I stood there, my mind reeling. Had I imagined it all? But no, I still had the photographs on my camera, the hair sample in my backpack. It had been real. So what had happened here? As I turned to leave, something caught my eye. Half buried in the leaves at the base of a large tree was a weathered piece of wood. I brushed away the debris, revealing what looked like an old hand-carved snowshoe. I picked it up, examining it closely. The craftsmanship was crude but effective, clearly designed for functionality rather than aesthetics. It was large, much larger than any commercially available snowshoe I'd ever seen. That's when it hit me. The footprints I'd been so excited about, the bare patch of earth around the shelter, it all made sense now. I hadn't discovered evidence of Bigfoot. I'd stumbled upon the campsite of someone living off the grid, someone who'd gone to great lengths to cultivate the Bigfoot myth to keep people away. I sank to the ground, overwhelmed by a mixture of disappointment and grudging admiration. Whoever had created this elaborate hoax had done an incredible job. They'd managed to fool even an experienced researcher like myself, at least temporarily. As I made my way back to civilization, my mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Part of me was devastated at the loss of what I'd thought was a groundbreaking discovery. But another part of me was oddly energized. If someone could create such a convincing hoax, who's to say the real thing wasn't still out there waiting to be found? I may not have discovered Bigfoot on this expedition, but I'd been reminded of an important lesson. In the world of cryptozoology, things are rarely what they seem. The line between fact and fiction, between the possible and the impossible, is often blurrier than we'd like to admit. As I drove away from the forest, I found myself smiling. This setback hadn't diminished my passion for the search. If anything, it had strengthened my resolve. Because out there, beyond the reach of our scientific instruments and preconceived notions, the undiscovered still waits, and I'll never stop looking. Story 10. I've spent most of my nights out here in the woods, patrolling the same trails, hearing the same sounds. You get used to the rhythm of it after a while, the quiet crunch of your boots on the dirt, the rustling of the wind through the trees, the distant cry of some animal in the night. It all becomes background noise. But tonight was different. I knew it as soon as I stepped out of the truck. The air was colder than it should have been for this time of year, thick with that wet, earthy smell that usually comes after a storm. Only there hadn't been any storm, just a strange, heavy mist that clung to the ground like it was waiting for something. I pulled my flashlight from the dashboard and clipped my radio to my belt. The trail ahead stretched into the dark, disappearing into the trees, the kind of darkness that eats up your light before it even has a chance to reach the ground. My breath hitched as I looked down the path. It was a feeling I couldn't shake, like something was just off. "All right, let's get this over with," I muttered to myself, flicking on the light. I had walked this trail 100 times before, but the forest felt different tonight, quieter. I usually found some comfort in the sounds of the woods, the scurrying of small animals, the distant hoot of an owl. But there was none of that now, just silence. The beam from my flashlight cut through the trees, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and twist in ways they shouldn't. The trail was narrow, winding deeper into the woods, and every few steps I caught myself glancing over my shoulder. Something was out here with me. I shook my head, trying to push the thought away. Maybe it was just the quiet getting to me. It'd been a long week, too many late nights, too much time alone out here. The forest had a way of messing with your head if you let it, but the feeling didn't go away. The deeper I went, the worse it got. I kept walking, my light flickering in and out as I moved along the trail. The mist clung to the ground, swirling around my boots with every step. I tried to focus, to push through the unease that was creeping up my spine, but something caught my eye up ahead. A branch snapped to my right. I froze, turning the flashlight in that direction. The beam wavered for a second before settling on a cluster of trees, their gnarled branches twisting together like skeletal fingers. My pulse quickened, the hair on the back of my neck standing up. There was something just beyond the light, barely visible through the fog. Another snap. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice sounding smaller than I meant it to. No answer, just the echo of my own words bouncing back at me. I clenched my jaw, stepping off the trail and moving toward the trees. My boots crunched through the underbrush, the sound too loud in the otherwise dead-silent forest. Every step felt heavier, like the air itself was pushing back against me. "Look, if you're messing with me, it's not funny," I said, trying to inject some authority into my voice. "Show yourself." Nothing. I moved deeper into the trees, the light from my flashlight barely cutting through the fog. That's when I saw them, footprints in the dirt, big, too big to be human. I crouched down, running my fingers over the indentations. The edges were deep, the shape unmistakable. My stomach twisted into knots as I stood back up, shining the light ahead. The prints led further into the woods, disappearing into the darkness. "Damn it," I muttered under my breath. I had a job to do. "Could be a bear," I told myself. Black bears weren't uncommon out here, especially this time of year. But something about those prints didn't sit right with me. They weren't just big, they were wrong. Another snap. This time, closer. I swung the flashlight around just in time to catch a glimpse of movement. Something large, moving between the trees, too fast for me to make out. "Hey!" I shouted, adrenaline surging through me as I took off toward the sound. I shouldn't have done that. I knew better. You never run after something out here, especially not at night, but I wasn't thinking straight. All I could focus on was that thing, whatever it was, moving through the trees, too fast to be an animal, too fast to be anything I'd ever seen before. The footprints led deeper into the woods, away from the trail. I followed them, my breath coming in short, sharp bursts. The air felt heavier now, thicker, like I was breathing through a wet blanket. My light flickered again, and for a second everything around me went dark. When the beam snapped back on, I was standing in a small clearing. The footprints ended abruptly in the center of the open space, like whoever, or whatever, had made them had just vanished. I stopped, my heart pounding in my chest. The silence pressed down on me like a weight, the fog swirling around my legs. My breath came in ragged gasps, and I struggled to slow my racing thoughts. That's when I heard it. A low, guttural sound, almost like a growl, but deeper. It came from somewhere in the trees behind me, the kind of sound that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand on end. I turned slowly, my flashlight trembling in my hand as I swept it across the tree line. My pulse was thudding in my ears, my skin prickling with fear. And then, just beyond the reach of the light, I saw it. Eyes. Glowing in the darkness, watching me. Too high off the ground to be a bear, too far apart to be human. They didn't blink, didn't move, just stared, locked onto me like a predator sizing up its prey. I swallowed hard, taking a slow step back. My hand moved to the radio on my belt, fingers fumbling to click it on. "Walt, come in," I whispered, my voice barely audible. Static. I swallowed again, backing up another step, my eyes never leaving those glowing orbs. The thing in the trees didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just watched, waiting. "Walt," I said again, louder this time, my voice shaking. "Something's out here." The static crackled to life, and Walt's voice came through, gruff and familiar. "Martin, what the hell's going on?" "There's something—" I trailed off, my eyes still locked on those glowing eyes. "I'm at Black Ridge, just off the main trail. There's something in the woods." Walt's voice cut through the static, sharp and serious. "What do you mean, something? Is it a bear?" "No," I whispered, shaking my head even though he couldn't see me. "It's bigger." The radio went silent for a moment, and in that silence I could hear it again. The low, deep growl closer now. The eyes hadn't moved, but I knew it was coming. "Get back to the truck," Walt said, his voice firm. "Now!" I didn't need to be told twice. I took another step back, then another, keeping my flashlight trained on those eyes as I moved toward the edge of the clearing. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. And then, without warning, the eyes disappeared. Gone. Just like that. The growl echoed through the trees, louder now, and I ran. I didn't care about staying quiet, didn't care about the noise I made as I crashed through the underbrush, my flashlight bouncing wildly in front of me. All I could think about was getting back to the truck, getting away from whatever was out there. Branches whipped at my face, roots tripped me up, but I didn't stop. I could hear it now. Footsteps heavy and fast, keeping pace with me in the trees. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I pushed on, the trail finally coming into view ahead. I stumbled onto the dirt path, my breath coming in ragged gasps, and sprinted toward the truck. The footsteps were closer now, almost on top of me. I reached the truck, yanking the door open and throwing myself inside. I slammed the door shut, locking it, my hands shaking as I fumbled for the keys. The engine roared to life, and I hit the gas, the tires kicking up dirt as I sped down the narrow road. My heart was still racing, my pulse pounding in my ears. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those glowing eyes staring back at me. But there was nothing. Just the dark, empty road stretching out behind me. I never saw it again. But I know it's still out there, waiting, watching. Story 11. The scream that shattered the pre-dawn silence wasn't human. It wasn't animal either. It was something in between, a sound that made my blood run cold and my finger freeze on the trigger of my rifle. In that moment, I knew the stories were true. There was something out here in these woods, something that shouldn't exist. My name is Javier Mendoza, and I've been hunting these mountains for over 30 years. I thought I knew every sound, every creature that called this wilderness home. But nothing in my experience had prepared me for what I was about to encounter on that fateful autumn morning. I'd set out before first light, my breath visible in the crisp mountain air as I made my way to my favorite hunting spot. It was opening day of elk season, and I was determined to bag a big one this year. The forest was quiet, save for the crunch of leaves under my boots and the occasional hoot of a distant owl. As I settled into my tree stand, the first hints of dawn began to color the eastern sky. I checked my rifle, more out of habit than necessity, and scanned the surrounding forest. That's when I heard it, that blood-curdling scream that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. My heart raced as I swiveled my head, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound. The forest had gone deathly quiet, as if every living creature was holding its breath. Then came the sound of breaking branches, something large moving through the underbrush at incredible speed. I raised my rifle, my hands shaking slightly as I peered through the scope. Whatever was out there, it was big. Much bigger than any elk or bear I'd ever encountered. A flash of movement caught my eye, and I swung the rifle towards it. For a split second, I saw it. A massive, dark shape, moving on two legs between the trees. It was too fast, too fluid in its movements to be a bear. My mind reeled, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. Another scream split the air, closer this time. It was answered by a different cry, unmistakably human, filled with pain and terror. Without thinking, I scrambled down from my tree stand. Someone was in trouble, and whatever had made that first sound was likely the cause. I moved as quickly and quietly as I could through the forest, my rifle at the ready. The human cries were getting weaker, interspersed with low, guttural growls that raised the hair on the back of my neck. As I crested a small ridge, I saw him. Another hunter, sprawled on the ground in a small clearing. His leg was bent at an unnatural angle, and even from this distance I could see the blood staining the leaves around him. I started to call out, to let him know help was on the way, when movement on the far side of the clearing stopped me cold. Something was emerging from the shadows of the trees, something big. At first, my mind couldn't process what I was seeing. It looked like a man, but wrong. Too tall, too broad, covered in dark, matted fur. Its arms were impossibly long, ending in hands with wickedly curved claws, but it was the face that truly chilled me to my core. A bizarre mix of human and animal features with eyes that held an unmistakable intelligence. The injured hunter saw it too. His eyes widened in terror, and he let out a strangled cry. "Oh God, help me! It's real! It's real!" The creature's head snapped towards the sound, and it let out a low, rumbling growl. I knew I had to act fast. I raised my rifle, taking aim at the beast's massive chest. "Hey!" I shouted, trying to draw its attention away from the injured man. "Over here!" It worked. The creature turned towards me, those unnervingly human eyes locking onto mine. For a moment we stared at each other, hunter and hunted, neither sure which was which. Then it charged. I squeezed the trigger, the rifle's report deafening in the small clearing. The creature stumbled, roaring in pain and rage, but it didn't go down. My shot had only grazed its shoulder, tearing a furrow through its thick fur. I worked the bolt, chambering another round, but it was too late. The beast was on me in a flash of fur and claws. My rifle went flying as I was knocked to the ground, the air driven from my lungs by the impact. Hot breath washed over my face, reeking of blood and decay. I could feel its claws digging into my shoulders, pinning me down. This was it, I thought. This was how I was going to die. But then, inexplicably, it hesitated. Those strangely human eyes bored into mine, filled with a mixture of rage and something else. Curiosity, intelligence. Whatever it was, it gave me the opening I needed. I drove my knee up hard, catching the creature in what I hoped was a vulnerable spot. It let out a roar of pain and reared back. I scrambled away, my hand closing around a fallen branch. I swung it with all my might, catching the beast across the face. It staggered back, shaking its massive head. I used the moment to snatch up my rifle, bringing it to bear just as the creature tensed to spring again. "Stop!" I yelled, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. "Just stop!" To my utter amazement, it did. The creature paused, cocking its head to one side as if considering my words. We stood there, frozen in a tableau that defied everything I thought I knew about the natural world. A groan from the injured hunter broke the spell. The creature's head whipped around, a low growl rumbling from its chest. I took a step forward, placing myself between it and the wounded man. "No," I said firmly, meeting its gaze. "Leave him alone." For a long moment, nothing moved. Then, slowly, the creature began to back away. It never took its eyes off me as it retreated to the edge of the clearing. With a final, ear-splitting roar that seemed to shake the very trees, it turned and vanished into the forest. I stood there, my rifle still trained on the spot where it had disappeared, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. It was the weak voice of the injured hunter that finally snapped me back to reality. What was that thing?" he gasped, his face pale with pain and shock. I lowered my rifle, moving quickly to his side. "I don't know," I admitted, as I began to assess his injuries. "But we need to get you out of here." As I worked to stabilize his broken leg and stem the bleeding from several deep gashes, my mind raced. What I'd seen defied explanation. It wasn't a bear, wasn't any known animal, but it wasn't human either. It was something in between. "You saw it too, right?" the injured man asked, his voice trembling. "I'm not crazy." I met his gaze, seeing the desperate need for confirmation in his eyes. "I saw it," I said quietly. It was real. Relief washed over his face, followed quickly by fear. "We have to tell someone. The authorities, the media. People need to know what's out here." I hesitated, thinking of the creature's eyes, that spark of intelligence I'd seen. If word got out, this forest would be swarming with hunters, scientists, thrill-seekers. And something told me that would end badly for everyone involved. "Let's focus on getting you to safety," I said finally. "We can figure out the rest later." As I helped the injured hunter to his feet, supporting most of his weight, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I scanned the tree line, half expecting to see those piercing eyes staring back at me. But the forest remained still and silent, giving no hint of the incredible encounter that had just taken place. As we began our slow, painful journey back to civilization, I found myself filled with a mixture of fear and awe. I'd come into these woods seeking a trophy, proof of my skill as a hunter. Instead, I'd found something that challenged everything I thought I knew about the natural world, a creature that walked the line between man and beast, that defied classification and understanding. As the adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a bone-deep weariness, one thought kept circling in my mind. In this vast wilderness, How many other secrets were hiding just beyond the reach of our understanding? And more importantly, were we ready to face them? The injured hunter's labored breathing beside me was a constant reminder of the danger we'd faced, the reality of what we'd seen. But as we made our way through the forest, I found myself casting glances over my shoulder, half hoping to catch another glimpse of the impossible. Because now I knew the truth. The legends were real, and nothing would ever be the same again. Story 12. I knew something was wrong the moment we saw the cabin. Frida had spotted it first through the thick trees, her voice cutting through the late afternoon quiet. "Look, there's a cabin over there," she'd said, pointing ahead. I hadn't even wanted to stop. We were hiking through a remote part of the forest, far off any trail, trying to reach the ridge before dark, but Frida insisted. "We'll lose the light," I muttered. But she was already heading toward it, excitement in her steps. "It's abandoned," she called back, ignoring my warning. "Look, we can stay here for the night. We won't make it up the ridge before sundown anyway." She wasn't wrong about that. The sun was sinking fast behind the tree line, shadows growing longer, stretching like fingers across the forest floor. I hated hiking in the dark. More than that, I hated the thought of wandering into an abandoned cabin we knew nothing about. But Frida had already made up her mind. I sighed, adjusted my pack, and followed her. The place was old, really old. The wood was weathered and cracked, shingles missing from the roof, and the windows were dark holes, glass long gone. A single door hung loosely on rusted hinges, creaking slightly in the breeze. "We can't stay here," I said, keeping my voice low, almost as if I was afraid someone, or something, would hear us. Frida was already stepping onto the sagging porch, her eyes wide with curiosity. "Why not? It's perfect. It'll keep us out of the cold." I hesitated, looking around. The trees were dense here, and the thick canopy overhead made the cabin feel even more isolated. There was something about it that made my skin crawl, the way it sat there, tucked away like a secret, forgotten by the world. "We don't know who owns it," I said, "and it looks like it could collapse any second." Frida rolled her eyes and pushed the door open with a loud creak. "Come on, Raoul, it's just for the night. What's the worst that could happen?" I wanted to tell her everything, that cabins like this had stories, stories of people who never left, of things that didn't stay buried. But I didn't. Instead, I followed her inside, my flashlight cutting through the dust-filled air. It was cramped inside, smaller than it had looked from the outside. The floor creaked under our weight, and the musty smell of rot and decay hung in the air. There was a small fireplace on one side, a few broken chairs, and a rickety table pushed against the far wall. A single window faced the forest, but it was so caked with grime that it barely let any light through. "I told you, this place is falling apart," I said, stepping over a patch of the floor that looked particularly weak. "We'd be better off setting up camp outside." Frida was already pulling off her pack, dumping it onto the table. "Don't be so dramatic, Raoul, it's fine." "Yeah, sure," I muttered, glancing around. "Fine." There was something wrong with the air in here. It felt heavier, like it was pressing down on me, making it harder to breathe. I rubbed my temples, trying to shake off the feeling, but it clung to me like a second skin. Frida must have sensed my discomfort because she turned to me, smiling like she always did when she thought I was being too cautious. "Look, let's just settle in for the night. We'll be out of here first thing in the morning." I didn't answer. I didn't want to fight, but I couldn't shake the unease that had settled in my gut. The longer we stayed here, the more it felt like we were intruding on something. Still, I helped Frida clear out a corner, laying down our sleeping bags near the fireplace. She got a small fire going, and for a while the warmth made the place feel a little less eerie. We ate in silence, the crackling of the flames the only sound in the otherwise suffocating quiet. I couldn't stop staring at the door. Something about it bothered me. The way it hung on those rusted hinges, barely hanging on. It looked like it had been opened and closed too many times, like something had forced its way in over and over again. "You're not eating," Frida said, snapping me out of my thoughts. I looked down at the food in my hands, suddenly realizing I wasn't hungry. "Yeah, I'm just tired." She smiled, but I could see the slight furrow of concern in her brow. "We'll be fine. It's just an old cabin, Raoul. Nothing's going to happen." I nodded, trying to force a smile, but I didn't believe her. Something had already happened. I could feel it in the air, the way the shadows seemed to move in the corners of the room, just out of sight. As the fire died down, the cabin grew darker, the shadows longer, and the feeling of being watched crept over me. I lay down in my sleeping bag, my back to the wall, eyes fixed on the door. It was too quiet now. The kind of quiet that sets your teeth on edge, makes your skin prickle. I could hear my own breathing, shallow and fast, and every once in a while I thought I heard something else, a faint creak, like someone or something was moving outside. "Raoul?" Frida whispered, her voice barely audible. "Yeah? Do you hear that?" I tensed. "What?" She was quiet for a moment before speaking again, her voice shaky. "There's something outside." I held my breath, listening. At first, I didn't hear anything, just the crackle of the dying fire and the soft wind outside. But then, there it was, a faint rustling, like footsteps in the leaves just beyond the cabin. My heart started to race. "It's probably just an animal," I whispered, though I didn't believe it for a second. Frida sat up, pulling her sleeping bag around her shoulders like a shield. "That's not an animal. Listen." The rustling grew louder, closer. I sat up, my hand instinctively reaching for the knife I kept in my pack. The door creaked again, a long, slow groan that sent a shiver down my spine. I glanced at Frida. Her face was pale, her eyes wide, locked on the door. "Maybe we should—" Before I could finish, there was a loud thud against the wall. Something had hit the side of the cabin, hard. "Raoul!" Frida's voice cracked. "Stay quiet," I whispered, my heart pounding in my chest. I slowly got to my feet, my eyes never leaving the door. Whatever was outside wasn't going away. The footsteps circled the cabin now, slow and deliberate, like it was searching for a way in. I tightened my grip on the knife, my mind racing. We were too far from any help, too isolated. I didn't have a gun, just this small blade and whatever fight I had in me. But deep down, I knew that wouldn't be enough. Another thud, this time on the other side of the cabin near the window. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, there was nothing but the sound of my own ragged breathing. Then the door creaked, and I felt my stomach drop. Slowly, the door began to open. Frida gasped, her hand flying to her mouth to muffle the sound. I took a step back, my eyes fixed on the widening crack in the door, waiting to see what would come through. But there was nothing. Just darkness. The door swung open, revealing the empty forest beyond, the mist swirling at the edge of the trees. I didn't move. Neither did Frida. We just stood there, staring at the open door, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. No figure stepped through, no shadow moved in the darkness. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "We're leaving," I whispered, barely able to get the words out. Frida nodded, her face pale. She grabbed her pack, her movements shaky, and I did the same. We didn't bother rolling up our sleeping bags. We just wanted to get out. As we stepped outside, the cold night air hit us like a slap. The forest was still, the mist thick and cloying, but the footsteps were gone. Whatever had been circling the cabin was no longer there. We didn't speak as we hurried back toward the trail, our breath coming in short, terrified bursts. The cabin disappeared behind us, swallowed by the trees, and with it, the oppressive weight that had been pressing down on us all night. It wasn't until we reached the ridge, hours later, that we finally stopped. Frida collapsed onto a fallen log, her face pale, her hands shaking. I stood there, staring back at the dark line of trees behind us, waiting for something to emerge. But nothing came. "We're not talking about this," Frida said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, unable to shake the feeling that whatever had been watching us was still out there. We never went back to that part of the forest again, but sometimes, late at night, I still hear the creak of that door opening in my mind. And I wonder, what would have happened if we had stayed? Story 13. The branches reached for me like gnarled fingers in the fading light. I'd never felt so alone, so exposed. As dusk settled over the forest, transforming familiar shapes into looming shadows, I realized with growing dread that I was lost, and something out there knew it. My name is Amara Okafor, and what started as a simple task, gathering firewood for our family's camping trip, had turned into a nightmare. At 17, I'd grown up camping in these woods, but I'd never ventured out alone so close to nightfall. Now, as the last rays of sunlight filtered through the canopy, I cursed my overconfidence. I clutched the few sticks I'd managed to gather close to my chest, as if they could offer some protection against the encroaching darkness. The forest, usually so alive with the sounds of birds and small animals, had grown unnaturally quiet. The silence pressed in on me, broken only by the crunch of leaves under my feet and my own ragged breathing. "Hello?" I called out, wincing at how small and frightened my voice sounded. "Is anyone there? Mom? Dad?" No answer came, save for the whisper of wind through the trees. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart. Panic wouldn't help me now. I needed to think, to remember what my parents had taught me about staying safe in the wilderness. Stay put, that was the first rule. Don't wander further and risk getting more lost. I looked around, searching for a suitable place to wait for rescue. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just another tree, its trunk twisted into an odd shape by time and the elements. But as I squinted through the gathering gloom, I realized with a jolt that it was moving. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, but definitely moving. My breath caught in my throat as the figure seemed to unfold itself, stretching to an impossible height. It was vaguely humanoid, but wrong in ways my mind struggled to process. Too tall, too thin, its limbs bent at unnatural angles. "Hello?" I stammered, taking an involuntary step backward. "Is someone there?" The figure didn't respond. It just stood there, swaying slightly in the breeze. Was it my imagination, or were those branch-like arms reaching towards me? Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I forced myself to remain still. "It's just a tree," I told myself. "Your eyes are playing tricks on you in the dark." But even as I thought it, I knew it wasn't true. There was something out there, something watching me. I fumbled for my phone with shaking hands, nearly dropping it in my haste. The screen lit up, momentarily blinding me. No signal, of course. But the flashlight. With trembling fingers, I activated it, pointing the beam towards the figure. For a split second I saw it clearly, not a tree at all, but a creature unlike anything I'd ever seen or imagined. Its body was gnarled and bark-like, its face a twisted mass of knots and hollows, and its eyes, two pinpricks of cold light that seemed to bore into my very soul. I screamed, the sound tearing from my throat before I could stop it. The creature jerked at the noise, its movements jerky and unnatural. Then, with a speed that defied its seemingly rigid form, it melted back into the shadows of the forest. My paralysis broke, and I ran. I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face, roots threatening to trip me with every step. I had no idea where I was going, only that I had to get away from whatever that thing was. As I ran, I became aware of movement in the forest around me. More shapes darting between the trees, always just at the edge of my vision. Were they real, or just tricks of the light and my panicked mind? I burst into a small clearing, gasping for breath. My legs trembled, threatening to give out. I spun in a circle, my phone's flashlight cutting arcs through the darkness. Nothing. The forest was still once more. As my breathing slowly returned to normal, doubt began to creep in. Had I really seen what I thought I'd seen, or had fear and the gathering darkness played tricks on my mind? "Amara!" A distant voice cut through the night, followed by the beam of a powerful flashlight. "Amara, where are you?" Relief flooded through me. "Dad!" I shouted. "I'm here! I'm over here!" Moments later, my father burst into the clearing, his face a mask of worry that quickly turned to relief. He enveloped me in a crushing hug. "Thank God," he murmured. "We've been looking everywhere for you." As he pulled back, his expression turned stern. "What were you thinking wandering off like that? You know better than to be out in the woods alone at night." I opened my mouth to explain, to tell him about the strange creature I'd seen, but something stopped me. How could I describe what I'd witnessed without sounding crazy, and more importantly, would telling him make it more real? I got turned around," I said finally. "I'm sorry. I should have been more careful." Dad's face softened. "It's okay. You're safe now. That's what matters." He put an arm around my shoulders, guiding me back towards our campsite. "Come on, your mother's worried sick." As we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see those eerie pinprick eyes staring back at me from the darkness. "Everything okay?" Dad asked, noticing my unease. I forced a smile. "Yeah, just glad to be heading back." When we reached the campsite, Mum rushed to embrace me, her words of relief and admonishment blurring together. I nodded along, assuring her I was fine, that I'd just gotten a little lost. But my mind was elsewhere, still back in that shadowy forest. That night, as I lay in our tent listening to the familiar sounds of my parents' breathing, sleep eluded me. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig outside had me sitting up, straining my ears. Was it out there, watching our camp? And if it was, what did it want? As the first light of dawn began to filter through the tent walls, I made a decision. I wouldn't tell anyone about what I'd seen. Who would believe me anyway? A tree that moved, that looked at me with intelligent eyes. I'd sound insane, but I knew what I'd experienced was real, and I knew I'd never look at the forest the same way again. In the light of day, I could almost convince myself it had all been a product of fear and an overactive imagination. Almost. We packed up camp that morning, my parents still shooting me concerned glances. As we hiked back to our car, I found myself scanning the trees, looking for any sign of the creature. But the forest seemed normal now, alive with birdsong and dappled sunlight. Just before we left the trailhead, I paused, looking back at the line of trees. For a moment, I thought I saw something, a flash of movement, a hint of a gnarled, bark-like form, but when I blinked, it was gone. "Amara," Mum called from the car, "everything okay?" I took a deep breath, tearing my gaze away from the forest. "Yeah," I said, forcing a smile, "everything's fine." As we drove away, leaving the wilderness behind, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was leaving something unfinished, that somewhere in those woods something was waiting, watching, and maybe, just maybe, wondering about me as much as I was wondering about it. I knew one thing for certain: I'd be back. The forest had shown me a glimpse of something beyond my understanding, something that both terrified and fascinated me. And despite the fear, despite the lingering doubt, I knew I had to know more. Because once you've seen the impossible, how can you ever go back to believing the world is exactly as you've always thought it to be? The creature in the woods had opened my eyes to a reality I never knew existed. And now, for better or worse, I was part of that reality too. As we rounded a bend in the road, the forest disappearing from view, I made a silent promise to myself. I would uncover the truth no matter how long it took. Because somewhere out there, in the depths of the wilderness, the impossible was waiting to be discovered, and I intended to be the one to find it. Story 14. The cabin loomed before us, a dark silhouette against the fading twilight. Its weathered boards and sagging roof spoke of years of abandonment, but it was the symbols carved into every available surface that sent a chill down my spine. This was no ordinary shelter, and I had a sinking feeling that bringing my hiking group here was a mistake we might not live to regret. My name is Ravi Patel, and I've been a wilderness guide in the Pacific Northwest for over a decade. I've led hundreds of hikers through these mountains, but never had I encountered anything like this. The 5 people huddled behind me, their faces a mix of exhaustion and growing unease, had no idea what we'd stumbled upon. But I did, and the knowledge sat like a lead weight in my gut. Ravi, what is this place? Sarah, a software engineer from Seattle, voiced the question on everyone's mind. I hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. It's an old trapper's cabin, I said finally, trying to keep my voice steady. Probably been abandoned for years, but it'll give us shelter for the night. Those markings, muttered Tom, an older man with a salt and pepper beard. They don't look like any trapper's signs I've ever seen. He was right, of course. The symbols carved into the wood were unlike anything I'd encountered in my years in these mountains. Spirals, jagged lines, and what looked unsettlingly like stylized eyes covered every inch of the cabin's exterior. Probably just some kids messing around, I lied, forcing a smile. Come on, let's get inside before it gets dark. As we approached the cabin, the sense of wrongness grew stronger. The air felt thick, charged with an energy I couldn't explain. The usual sounds of the forest, birds, insects, the rustle of small animals, had faded to an eerie silence. The door creaked open at my touch, swinging inward to reveal a single room thick with dust and cobwebs. Old furniture lay scattered about, a table, some chairs, a bed frame with a rotting mattress. But it was the far wall that drew everyone's attention. "Oh my God," whispered Lisa, her hand flying to her mouth. The entire wall was covered in more of those strange symbols, these carved deeper and with a frantic energy that was palpable even after all this time. And in the center, pinned with what looked like hand-forged nails, was a book. "What is that?" asked Mike, taking a step closer. "Don't touch it," I said sharply, maybe too sharply. Everyone turned to look at me, surprise and suspicion in their eyes. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart. "Look, we're all tired and on edge. Let's just get set up for the night, okay? We can check out the decorations in the morning." There were murmurs of agreement as everyone began unpacking sleeping bags and preparing a simple meal. But I could feel their eyes on me, sense their growing unease. They knew I wasn't telling them everything. As night fell, casting the cabin into deep shadows, I found myself unable to look away from that book on the wall. Its presence seemed to dominate the room, a silent promise or threat of revelations to come. Sleep was elusive that night. Every creak of the old boards, every whisper of wind outside had me sitting up, straining my ears for... What? I wasn't sure. But I knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that we weren't alone out here. It was just before dawn when I heard it, a low, mournful howl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I bolted upright, my heart pounding. What was that? Sarah's voice came from across the room, thick with sleep but edged with fear. "Probably just a coyote," I lied again, hating myself for it. "Go back to sleep." But sleep was impossible now. As the first grey light of dawn filtered through the grimy windows, I made a decision. I had to know what was in that book. Carefully, trying not to wake the others, I made my way to the far wall. The nails came out easier than I expected, as if the book wanted to be freed. As it fell into my hands, I felt a jolt like static electricity, but stronger, more alive. I opened it with trembling fingers, and my world shifted on its axis. The pages were filled with cramped, hurried writing, interspersed with more of those bizarre symbols. As I read, my breath caught in my throat. It was a journal, dated nearly 50 years ago, detailing encounters with something the writer called the forest creature. The entries started normally enough, observations of strange tracks, unusual animal behavior, but as I turned the pages, the tone grew more frantic, paranoid. The writer spoke of a massive bipedal creature, covered in fur, but with disturbingly human-like features, of its impossible speed and strength, its ability to appear and disappear at will, and then, most chillingly, of its intelligence. The final entries described attempts at communication, of the creature learning, evolving. The last page was a mess of those symbols, carved so deeply they'd torn through the paper in places. "Ravi, what are you doing?" I jumped at Tom's voice, nearly dropping the book. He was watching me from his sleeping bag, his eyes narrow with suspicion. I was just curious," I stammered. "About what?" He stood up, moving closer. "What's really going on here, Ravi? What aren't you telling us?" His raised voice woke the others. Soon, I found myself surrounded by my group, their faces a mix of fear, anger, and confusion. "You know something about this place," Sarah accused. "About those symbols. Tell us the truth." I looked at their faces, saw the trust I'd built over the past few days crumbling before my eyes, and I knew I couldn't lie anymore. "All right," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "All right. You deserve to know." Over the next hour, as the sun rose fully, painting the cabin in harsh light that somehow made it even more ominous, I told them everything. About the legends I'd heard from old-timers in these parts, of a creature that was neither man nor beast, about the missing hikers over the years, the unexplained phenomena, and about my own encounter years ago that I'd tried so hard to forget. "So you brought us here on purpose?" Lisa's voice was thick with accusation. "You used us as bait." "No," I protested. "God, no, I thought the stories were just that. Stories. I never believed." I trailed off, realizing how hollow my excuses sounded. "We need to leave," Mike said firmly. "Now, before—" He was cut off by another howl, closer this time. Much closer. We all froze, eyes wide with fear. "It's here," I whispered. The next few minutes were a blur of frantic activity as we grabbed our packs and made for the door. But as I reached for the handle, a massive shadow fell across the grimy window. "Oh, God," Sarah whimpered. I turned slowly, already knowing what I'd see. There, peering in through the window, was a face that haunted my nightmares. Massive, covered in shaggy fur, with eyes that held an intelligence that was terrifyingly human. For a long moment, we stared at each other. 5 terrified humans and 1 impossible creature. Then slowly, deliberately, it raised one massive hand and began to trace symbols in the grime on the window. Symbols that matched those in the book I still clutched in my trembling hands. "It's communicating," Tom breathed. As I watched those massive fingers move with surprising delicacy, I felt a paradigm shift in my understanding of the world. This wasn't just some undiscovered animal. This was something more, something that challenged everything we thought we knew about evolution, about consciousness itself. And as those intelligent eyes met mine once more, I knew with absolute certainty that our lives would never be the same. We had crossed a threshold, stumbled into a reality where the lines between myth and fact, between human and other, blurred into insignificance. The creature, no, the being, outside the window finished its message and stepped back, waiting. And I knew, with a mixture of terror and exhilaration, that what happened next would depend entirely on us, on our ability to overcome our fear, to reach out across the chasm of the unknown. "What do we do?" Lisa whispered, her voice trembling. I took a deep breath, squaring my shoulders. "We answer," I said, moving towards the window. "We answer, and we hope to God we're ready for what comes next." As I raised my hand to the grimy glass, mirroring the creature's gesture, I realized that this moment, this impossible, terrifying, wondrous moment, was why I'd become a guide in the first place. to lead people not just through physical wilderness, but into the uncharted territories of human experience. And as I began to trace my response in the grime, I silently promised my group and myself that whatever happened next, we would face it together. Because some discoveries are too important, too world-changing to face alone. The journey that had led us to this cabin was over, but a new one, far more profound and perilous, was just beginning. Story 15. The howl that echoed through the forest that night wasn't like anything I'd heard before. It sent a chill down my spine, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I'd been a forest ranger for over a decade, but nothing could have prepared me for what I was about to encounter. My name is Akira Tanaka, and I've spent the better part of my life in these woods. The Aokigahara Forest, often called the Sea of Trees, has been my home away from home since I was a kid. I thought I knew every inch of this place, every sound, every smell. But that night, everything changed. It was a routine patrol, or so I thought. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. My flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the path ahead. The forest was quieter than usual, the typical nocturnal symphony conspicuously absent. I paused, listening intently. Something felt off. That's when I noticed the first set of tracks. "What the hell?" I muttered, crouching down to examine them more closely. The prints were unlike anything I'd seen before, too large for a bear, too defined for a wolf. They were deep, pressing into the soft forest floor with significant weight. Whatever made these was big, really big. I pulled out my radio, hesitating for a moment before keying the mic. "Base, this is Tanaka. I found some unusual tracks out here. Might be worth checking out in the morning." Static crackled before a response came through. "Copy that, Tanaka. What's your location?" I gave them my coordinates and continued my patrol, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in my gut. The tracks seemed to meander through the forest, sometimes disappearing only to reappear several meters away. As I followed the trail, the forest seemed to grow denser, the trees closing in around me. The beam of my flashlight caught something reflective up ahead. I approached cautiously, my heart rate picking up. It was a scrap of fabric caught on a low-hanging branch. I reached out, carefully removing it. It looked like a piece of a hiking jacket, torn and frayed at the edges. A sick feeling washed over me as I realized it was stained with what looked like dried blood. "Shit," I breathed, reaching for my radio again. But before I could call it in, that howl pierced the night once more. Closer this time, much closer. I spun around, my flashlight beam dancing wildly across the trees. That's when I saw it, a massive silhouette moving between the trunks. It was tall, far taller than any animal I'd ever encountered in these woods, and it was bipedal. My breath caught in my throat. I stood frozen, watching as the figure moved with an unnatural grace for its size. It paused, and I swear I could feel its gaze upon me. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shakier than I'd like to admit. "This is Forest Ranger Tanaka. Identify yourself." No response came, just the sound of snapping twigs as the figure moved again. I took a step back, my hand instinctively moving to the tranquilizer gun at my hip. We were trained to use them for aggressive wildlife, but somehow I doubted it would be much use against whatever this was. The radio at my belt crackled to life, making me jump. "Tanaka, this is Base. Everything all right out there?" I fumbled for the radio, my eyes never leaving the spot where I'd last seen the figure. "Base, I've got a situation here. There's something in the woods. I can't identify it." "Could you repeat that, Tanaka? You're breaking up." Before I could respond, a low, rumbling growl emanated from the darkness. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard. Not quite animal, not quite human. My blood ran cold. "I need backup," I whispered into the radio. "Send someone. Now." I began to back away slowly, my eyes darting around the forest. The growl came again, closer this time. I could hear heavy breathing, the sound of something large moving through the underbrush. Suddenly, a pair of eyes reflected in my flashlight beam. They were set high off the ground, far higher than any known predator in these woods, and they were intelligent, studying me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "Stay back!" I shouted, drawing my tranquilizer gun. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely aim. "I'm warning you!" The creature let out another howl, so close now it made my ears ring. I fired off a shot, the dart disappearing into the darkness. There was a moment of silence, then a roar of rage that shook the trees. I turned and ran. Branches whipped at my face as I tore through the forest. I could hear it behind me, crashing through the undergrowth. It was fast, impossibly fast for something so large. My lungs burned as I sprinted, leaping over fallen logs and ducking under low-hanging branches. The forest I knew so well had become a maze, every tree looking the same in the darkness. I risked a glance over my shoulder and immediately regretted it. The creature was gaining on me, its massive form briefly illuminated by my wildly swinging flashlight. It was covered in thick, dark fur, its arms unnaturally long, ending in hands tipped with wicked claws. I veered sharply to the left, hoping to throw it off. My foot caught on an exposed root, and I went down hard, the air driven from my lungs. The flashlight flew from my hand, spinning across the forest floor before going out, plunging me into darkness. Gasping for breath, I scrambled to my feet. I could hear the creature slowing, its heavy breathing drawing nearer. I pressed my back against a tree, trying desperately to control my own ragged breaths. For a moment, all was silent. Then, a low, rumbling sound began to my right. It took me a second to realize what it was. The creature was sniffing the air, trying to locate me. I closed my eyes, silently praying to whatever gods might be listening. The sniffing grew louder, closer. I could feel its breath hot and rank on my face. Slowly, I opened my eyes. In the dim moonlight filtering through the canopy, I could make out its massive form. It stood easily 8 feet tall, its broad shoulders hunched as it leaned in close. Its face was a nightmarish blend of human and animal features, with a protruding snout and sharp, gleaming teeth. Our eyes met, and in that moment, I saw something that chilled me to my core. There was intelligence in those eyes, a spark of something almost human. The creature tilted its head, studying me. Then, to my utter shock, it spoke. "Run!" The word was guttural, barely recognizable as human speech, but unmistakable. I didn't need to be told twice. I bolted, my legs pumping furiously as I tore through the forest. Behind me, I could hear the creature's roar, followed by the sound of it giving chase, but this time it seemed to be holding back, almost as if it was toying with me. I ran until my legs gave out, collapsing in a small clearing. My chest heaved as I gulped in air, my entire body trembling with exhaustion and fear. I waited for the creature to pounce, to finish me off, but nothing came. Slowly, I raised my head, looking around the clearing. There was no sign of the creature. The forest had fallen silent once more, save for the sound of my own labored breathing. I don't know how long I sat there, too afraid to move, too exhausted to run. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, I heard the distant sound of voices calling my name. "Tanaka! Akira Tanaka!" Relief flooded through me as I recognized the voices of my fellow rangers. I struggled to my feet, my legs shaky and weak. "Here!" I called out, my voice hoarse. "I'm here!" As my colleagues burst into the clearing, their faces a mix of concern and relief, I couldn't help but look back into the forest. In the growing light, I could see no sign of the creature or the chase from the night before. If it weren't for my torn clothes, the scratches on my arms, and the lingering sense of terror, I might have thought it was all a dream. "Akira, what happened?" Hiroshi, my supervisor, asked as he reached me. "We've been searching for you all night." I opened my mouth to explain, then closed it again. How could I possibly describe what I'd seen? Who would believe me? I got lost," I finally said. the lie tasting bitter on my tongue. Thought I saw something unusual and got turned around in the dark. Hiroshi frowned, clearly not entirely convinced, but he nodded, patting me on the shoulder. Well, we're just glad you're safe. Let's get you back to base and checked out. As we made our way out of the forest, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I glanced back one last time, and for a brief moment I swore I saw a pair of intelligent eyes watching me from the shadows. The creature's words echoed in my mind. Run! It had let me go, but why? And more importantly, what was it? One thing was certain. My nights in the Aokigahara forest would never be the same again. Whatever I had encountered that night, whatever strange creature called these woods home, I knew our paths would cross again, and next time I would be ready. Story 16. The zipper of my tent inched up slowly, each metallic click echoing in the stillness of the night. My hand trembled as I peered out into the darkness, heart pounding against my ribs. The heavy breathing I'd heard moments ago had stopped, but the silence that followed was far more terrifying. My name is Elena Kovac, and I never should have gone camping alone. It all started as a way to prove something to myself. After a messy breakup and a string of career setbacks, I needed to show that I could still tackle challenges head-on. A solo camping trip in the remote wilderness of Montana seemed like the perfect solution. Now, as I cowered in my tent, I realized how naive I'd been. The day had started promisingly enough. I'd hiked deep into the backcountry, reveling in the solitude and the crisp mountain air. By late afternoon, I'd found the perfect spot to set up camp, a small clearing nestled between towering pines, with a babbling stream nearby. As I hammered the last tent stake into the ground, a twig snapped in the forest behind me. I whirled around, but saw nothing except the dense undergrowth and lengthening shadows. "Just a deer," I muttered to myself, shaking off the sudden chill that ran down my spine. I busied myself with setting up the rest of the camp, gathering firewood and preparing dinner. As night fell, I sat by the crackling fire, watching the stars emerge in the inky sky above. The forest was alive with the sounds of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. It wasn't until I was tucked into my sleeping bag that I heard it, a deep, rumbling breath just outside my tent. At first, I thought I was imagining things. But then it came again, closer this time. "Hello," I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. "Is someone there?" No response came, just another heavy exhale. Whatever was out there, it was big. I lay perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Eventually, the sound of heavy footsteps faded into the distance, and I allowed myself to relax slightly. Sleep came in fitful bursts, my dreams plagued by shadowy figures and glowing eyes. When dawn finally broke, I unzipped the tent with shaky hands, dreading what I might find. The campsite looked undisturbed at first glance, but as I stepped out of the tent, my blood ran cold. Encircling my entire camp were massive footprints, easily twice the size of my own. They were deeply pressed into the soft earth, indicating whatever made them was incredibly heavy. "This isn't happening," I whispered, my eyes darting from print to print. "This can't be real." I grabbed my camera from the tent and started taking pictures, my hands shaking so badly I had to brace myself against a tree. As I moved around the perimeter of the camp, I noticed something that made my stomach lurch. Tufts of coarse, dark hair caught on the lower branches of a nearby pine. Swallowing hard, I reached out and carefully plucked one of the hairs. It was thick and wiry, unlike anything I'd ever seen before. I tucked it into a small plastic bag, my mind racing with possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. I needed to get out of there, fast. I started breaking down the camp, my movements frantic and clumsy. Every snapping twig or rustling leaf made me jump. I was so focused on packing that I almost missed the sound, a long, low howl that echoed through the valley. I froze, the tent pole in my hand clattering to the ground. The howl came again, closer this time. It wasn't like a wolf or any animal I'd ever heard. It was deeper, almost guttural, with an almost human-like quality that sent shivers down my spine. "Okay, Elena," I said aloud, trying to steady my nerves. "You need to move, now." I abandoned any pretense of properly packing up. I shoved what I could into my backpack, leaving the tent half-collapsed on the ground. As I shouldered my pack, a branch snapped loudly in the forest behind me. I ran. The trail was rough and overgrown, slowing my progress. I stumbled over roots and rocks, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The weight of my hastily packed bag threw off my balance, causing me to careen wildly around corners. Another howl pierced the air, much closer now. I chanced a glance over my shoulder and immediately regretted it. Through the trees, I caught a glimpse of something large moving with incredible speed. It was upright, but definitely not human. My foot caught on an exposed root, and I went down hard. Pain shot through my ankle as I scrambled to my feet. I limped forward, knowing I couldn't outrun whatever was behind me. Up ahead, I spotted a cluster of large boulders. Without thinking, I veered off the trail and climbed up the rocks, wedging myself into a narrow crevice. I pressed my back against the cool stone, trying to control my breathing. Heavy footsteps approached, accompanied by that same deep, rumbling breath I'd heard the night before. I clamped a hand over my mouth, tears streaming down my face. A shadow fell across the opening of my hiding spot. I could smell it now, a musky animal odor that made my nose wrinkle. My entire body trembled as I waited for it to find me, to drag me out of my pitiful refuge. But after what felt like an eternity, the footsteps moved away. I stayed frozen in place, too terrified to move. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the forest floor, I finally gathered the courage to peek out. The clearing was empty. I climbed down from the rocks on shaky legs, my ankle throbbing with each step. I needed to find help, to get back to civilization before night fell again. I limped down the trail as quickly as I could, jumping at every sound. As darkness settled over the forest, I spotted a flickering light through the trees, a campfire. Relief flooded through me as I stumbled towards the light. As I broke through the tree line, I saw two startled faces looking up at me, a man and woman seated by a small fire. "Help!" I gasped, collapsing to my knees. "Please, you have to help me." The couple rushed to my side, their expressions a mix of concern and confusion. "What happened?" the woman asked, helping me to sit by the fire. "Are you hurt?" I opened my mouth to explain, but where could I even begin? How could I describe what I'd seen, what had been hunting me through the forest? I got lost," I finally said, the lie tasting bitter on my tongue. "Twisted my ankle. I've been trying to find my way back all day." The man nodded sympathetically. "You're lucky we were out here. We're about 5 miles from the ranger station. We can help you get there in the morning." As they fussed over me, offering water and food, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I glanced nervously into the darkness beyond the firelight, half expecting to see glowing eyes staring back at me. Did you hear anything strange last night?" I asked hesitantly. "Any weird noises or howls?" The couple exchanged a look. "Can't say that we did," the man replied. "Though we did find some odd tracks this morning. Biggest prints I've ever seen. Thought maybe it was a grizzly, but the ranger said there haven't been any in this area for years." A chill ran down my spine. "What do you think made them?" The woman shrugged. "Who knows? Probably just a big black bear. Nothing to worry about as long as we keep our food sealed up tight." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. They had no idea what was really out there, what had been stalking me through the forest. Part of me wanted to tell them everything, to warn them of the danger, but I knew how it would sound, the ravings of a scared, exhausted woman. As we settled in for the night, The couple in their tent and me wrapped in a spare sleeping bag by the fire. I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Whatever I had encountered out there, whatever had left those massive footprints around my camp, was still out there. I stared into the flames, my mind racing. The hair sample I'd collected was still in my pocket, along with the photos on my camera. When I got back to civilization, I'd have proof. Maybe then someone would believe me. A twig snapped in the darkness beyond our camp. I sat up, my heart racing. Was it back? Had it followed me? But no other sounds came, just the normal noises of the forest at night. I lay back down, trying to convince myself it was nothing, but as I drifted off into an uneasy sleep, one thought kept circling in my mind. What if it was just waiting for the right moment to strike? Story 17. The shutter clicked, capturing what I thought was just another peaceful forest scene. It wasn't until later, when I reviewed the photos, that I realized how wrong I'd been. There, in the shadowy background, was something that shouldn't exist, something that would change my life forever. My name is Mateo Alvarez, and I'm a wildlife photographer, or at least I was. Now, I'm not sure what I am anymore. It was supposed to be a routine assignment, a week in the remote forests of the Pacific Northwest, capturing images of the local fauna for a nature magazine. I'd done dozens of similar jobs before, spending countless hours in the wilderness waiting for the perfect shot. But nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered in those woods. The first few days were uneventful. I set up my base camp in a small clearing, surrounded by towering pines and the constant murmur of a nearby stream. Each morning, I'd venture out before dawn, camera in hand, ready to capture whatever the forest had to offer. It was on the fourth day that things started to feel off. I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. At first, I dismissed it as paranoia, the natural unease that comes from being alone in the wilderness. But as the day wore on, the feeling intensified. I was crouched by a fallen log, my lens focused on a family of raccoons, when I heard it, a low, rumbling sound that wasn't quite a growl, wasn't quite human. The raccoons scattered and I spun around, my heart pounding. There was nothing there, just the endless sea of trees, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. But I couldn't shake the certainty that something had been there just moments ago. "Get it together, Mateo," I muttered to myself, running a hand through my hair. "You're letting your imagination run wild." I tried to focus on my work, but my nerves were shot. Every snapping twig made me jump, every shadow seemed to move. As the sun began to set, I decided to call it a day and head back to camp. That's when I saw it. Out of the corner of my eye, a massive figure moved between the trees. It was too big to be a bear, too fast to be a moose, and it was walking on two legs. I raised my camera instinctively, years of training kicking in. The shutter clicked rapidly as I captured a series of shots. The figure paused, and for a heart-stopping moment I thought it had heard me. Then it was gone, melting into the shadows with impossible speed. My hands shook as I lowered the camera. What had I just seen? My mind raced through possibilities, each more outlandish than the last. Bigfoot, some undiscovered species, a man in a suit. I practically ran back to my camp, my breath coming in ragged gasps. As soon as I reached my tent, I pulled out my laptop and downloaded the photos. Most were blurry, showing nothing more than a dark smudge against the trees. But one was clear enough to make my blood run cold. The figure was unmistakably bipedal, covered in thick dark fur. Its arms were long, ending in hands that looked almost human, but not quite. And its face, God, its face. It was a nightmarish blend of human and animal features, with deep-set eyes that seemed to stare right through the camera. "This can't be real," I whispered, my finger hovering over the delete button, but I couldn't do it. Whatever I had captured, whatever was out there in the woods, I needed proof. I spent a restless night in my tent, jumping at every sound. When dawn finally broke, I packed up my gear with shaky hands. I needed to get out of there, to show someone what I'd found. As I shouldered my backpack, a twig snapped behind me. I whirled around, my heart in my throat. There it was, standing at the edge of the clearing. In the early morning light, I could see it clearly. It was even larger than I'd thought, easily 8 feet tall. Its muscular body was covered in dark, matted fur, and its eyes were fixed on me with an intelligence that sent chills down my spine. For a moment we just stared at each other. Then slowly, deliberately, it raised one massive hand and pointed at my camera. I stumbled backward, my mouth dry. "What? What are you?" I managed to croak out. The creature tilted its head, studying me. Then, to my utter shock, it spoke. The sound was guttural, barely recognizable as speech, but I understood it all the same. "No. Picture." I nodded frantically, my hand fumbling for the camera strap. Okay, no picture, I'll delete it, just please don't hurt me." The creature took a step forward, and I flinched, but it simply reached out and plucked the camera from my grasp with surprising gentleness. With one powerful squeeze, it crushed the device, letting the pieces fall to the forest floor. "Go," it growled, gesturing towards the trail. "Never return." I didn't need to be told twice. I turned and ran, leaving behind my tent and most of my gear. My legs pumped furiously as I tore down the trail, branches whipping at my face. I didn't slow down until I reached my car, parked at the trailhead miles away. As I fumbled with my keys, I glanced back at the forest. For a brief moment, I thought I saw a large, dark figure watching me from between the trees. Then it was gone, leaving me to question if I'd imagined the whole thing. But I knew I hadn't. The memory card from my camera was still in my pocket, containing the one photo that had survived, the photo that would change everything. I drove straight to the nearest town, my mind racing. What should I do? Go to the authorities? The media? Would anyone even believe me? I pulled into a small diner, desperate for a cup of coffee and a moment to think. As I sat at the counter, hands wrapped around a steaming mug, the TV above the bar caught my attention. In local news, another hiker has gone missing in the Olympic National Forest, the anchor was saying. This marks the 3rd disappearance in the area this year. Search and rescue teams are... I tuned out the rest, my blood running cold. The Olympic National Forest. That's where I'd been, where I'd seen... it. "Excuse me," I said to the waitress, "has there been any talk about, well, anything strange in those woods? Any unusual sightings?" She gave me an odd look. "You mean besides the missing hikers? Well, there's always been stories. You know, Bigfoot and all that. Some of the old-timers swear they've seen something out there. But it's just tall tales, if you ask me." I nodded, forcing a smile. "Right, of course, just tall tales." As I left the diner, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was now part of something much bigger than myself. The creature in the woods, the missing hikers, the local legends, it all seemed connected. I got back in my car, the memory card burning a hole in my pocket. I had a choice to make. I could go public with what I'd seen, potentially putting myself in danger and facing ridicule. Or I could keep it to myself, letting the truth remain hidden. As I pulled onto the highway, heading back towards civilization, I made my decision. The world deserved to know the truth, whatever the consequences might be. And I was the one who had to tell it, but as I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. In my rearview mirror, the forest loomed dark and imposing. And somewhere in those woods, I knew something was waiting. Something that didn't want to be discovered. I pressed down on the accelerator, the trees blurring past. Whatever happened next, one thing was certain. My life would never be the same again. The image I'd captured, the creature I'd encountered, had changed everything, and I had a feeling this was only the beginning. Story 18. The cave mouth yawned before me, a gaping maw of darkness that seemed to swallow the fading daylight. I hesitated at the threshold, my headlamp casting eerie shadows on the rough stone walls. Something about this place felt wrong, but curiosity pushed me forward. I had no idea that stepping into that cavern would change my life forever. My name is Lena Novak, and I'm a geologist specializing in cave formations, or at least I was. Now, I'm not sure what I am. Perhaps a witness to something that shouldn't exist, or maybe just another victim of the wilderness. It was supposed to be a routine expedition. The Carpathian Mountains were rich with unexplored cave systems, and my team had been granted permission to survey a newly discovered network near the Ukrainian border. I'd volunteered to do an initial sweep of the main cavern, mapping out the basic structure before the rest of the team arrived the next day. The first thing that struck me as I entered the cave was the smell. Most caves have a distinct odor, damp earth, minerals, sometimes the musty scent of bat guano. But this was different. It was a heavy animal musk that made my nose wrinkle in disgust. Just some local wildlife, I muttered to myself, trying to shake off the unease that had settled in my gut. I moved deeper into the cavern, my headlamp illuminating the way. The limestone walls were slick with moisture, and I could hear the distant drip of water echoing through the chamber. As I rounded a bend, my light fell upon something that made me pause. Claw marks. Deep, jagged grooves carved into the stone wall. I approached slowly, my heart rate picking up. These weren't like any claw marks I'd seen before. They were too high up the wall for a bear, too large for a wolf or lynx. And the pattern, it was almost methodical, as if whatever had made them had been trying to communicate. I pulled out my camera, snapping several photos. As I lowered the device, something crunched under my boot. I looked down and felt my blood run cold. Bones. Scattered across the cave floor were dozens of bones, some clearly animal, others disturbingly human-like. "Okay, Lena," I said aloud, my voice shaky. "Time to get out of here and call in the authorities." But as I turned to leave, a low growl echoed through the cavern. It wasn't the sound of shifting rocks or water. It was distinctly animal and close. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Slowly, I turned my head, scanning the darkness beyond the reach of my headlamp. For a moment, all I could see was blackness. Then, two eyes reflected in the light, set high off the ground. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. "Is someone there?" No response came, just another low growl that seemed to vibrate through the very stone beneath my feet. I took a step backward, my foot sliding on the damp cave floor. In that moment of imbalance, something moved in the shadows. It was massive, easily 7 or 8 feet tall, and covered in what looked like thick, matted fur. Terror gripped me and I ran. I sprinted back the way I'd come, my headlamp bouncing wildly, casting frantic shadows across the cave walls. Behind me, I could hear heavy footsteps and the sound of labored breathing. As I neared the cave entrance, my foot caught on an outcropping of rock. I went down hard, pain shooting through my ankle. I scrambled to my feet, limping towards the fading daylight. I burst out of the cave, gasping for air. The forest around me was silent, unnaturally so. No birdsong, no rustling leaves, just the sound of my own ragged breathing. I glanced back at the cave entrance, half expecting to see the creature emerge, but there was nothing, just the yawning darkness of the cavern mouth. With shaking hands, I pulled out my satellite phone and dialed my team leader. "Marcus, it's Lena. We have a situation." "Lena? What's wrong? You sound terrible." I took a deep breath, trying to steady my voice. I found something in the cave, something that shouldn't be there. I need you to contact the local authorities, and maybe bring some firepower when you come tomorrow." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Firepower? Lena, what exactly did you see in there?" I opened my mouth to explain, then closed it again. How could I describe what I'd encountered? Who would believe me? Just trust me on this, Marcus. Something dangerous is living in that cave. We need to be prepared. After hanging up, I made my way back to my campsite, constantly looking over my shoulder. As night fell, I sat by my small fire, jumping at every sound from the surrounding forest. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those reflective eyes staring back at me from the darkness. I kept my flashlight close, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. It was nearing dawn when I heard it, a long, mournful howl that echoed through the mountains. It wasn't like any wolf I'd ever heard. It was deeper, almost guttural, with an almost human-like quality that sent shivers down my spine. As the first light of day began to filter through the trees, I heard the sound of vehicles approaching. Relief flooded through me as I saw the familiar SUVs of my research team, along with several police cars. Marcus was the first to reach me, his face etched with concern. "Lena, you look like hell. What happened out here?" I opened my mouth to explain, but the words caught in my throat. How could I possibly describe what I'd seen? Before I could answer, one of the local police officers approached, his expression grim. "Ms. Novak, we're going to need you to show us this cave you reported." I nodded, swallowing hard. As we made our way back towards the cavern, I recounted what I'd seen: the claw marks, the bones, the creature in the shadows. I could see the skepticism in their eyes, but they listened politely. As we neared the cave entrance, the officer in charge held up a hand, stopping the group. "Wait here," he said, drawing his weapon. "We'll do an initial sweep." I watched as he and two other officers disappeared into the darkness of the cave. Minutes ticked by, the tension palpable among those of us waiting outside. Suddenly, shouting erupted from within the cavern, followed by the sound of gunshots. My heart leapt into my throat as the officers came running out, their faces pale with fear. "Call for backup," the lead officer barked into his radio, "and get these civilians out of here, now!" As Marcus ushered me and the rest of the team back towards the vehicles, I caught a glimpse of something emerging from the cave. It was just for a moment, but it was enough to confirm my worst fears. The creature stood in the cave mouth, its massive form silhouetted against the darkness. It let out a roar that shook the very ground beneath our feet, then melted back into the shadows. In the chaos that followed, the arrival of more police, the evacuation of the area, the endless questions from authorities, one thought kept circling in my mind. What had we awakened in that cave? And more importantly, could it ever be contained again? As I sat in the back of an ambulance, a shock blanket draped over my shoulders, a young police officer approached me. "Ms. Novak, I need to ask you to keep what you saw here today to yourself, for now at least. We don't want to cause a panic." I nodded numbly, knowing that even if I wanted to talk about it, who would believe me? The creature in the cave defied explanation, challenged everything I thought I knew about the natural world. As we drove away from the site, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Whatever lived in that cave, whatever ancient secret we had disturbed, was now awake, and I had a sinking feeling that it wouldn't stay hidden for long. The mountains loomed in the rearview mirror, dark and foreboding. Somewhere in those peaks, something was stirring, something that had been waiting a very long time to be discovered, and I, Lena Novak, had been the one to find it. For better or for worse, my life would never be the same again. The cave mouth yawned before me, a gaping maw of darkness that seemed to swallow the fading daylight. I hesitated at the threshold, my headlamp casting eerie shadows on the rough stone walls. Something about this place felt wrong, but curiosity pushed me forward. I had no idea that stepping into that cavern would change my life forever. My name is Lena Novak, and I'm a geologist specializing in cave formations. Or at least, I was. Now, I'm not sure what I am. perhaps a witness to something that shouldn't exist, or maybe just another victim of the wilderness. It was supposed to be a routine expedition. The Carpathian Mountains were rich with unexplored cave systems, and my team had been granted permission to survey a newly discovered network near the Ukrainian border. I'd volunteered to do an initial sweep of the main cavern, mapping out the basic structure before the rest of the team arrived the next day. The first thing that struck me as I entered the cave was the smell. Most caves have a distinct odor, damp earth, minerals, sometimes the musty scent of bat guano. But this was different. It was a heavy animal musk that made my nose wrinkle in disgust. Just some local wildlife, I muttered to myself, trying to shake off the unease that had settled in my gut. I moved deeper into the cavern, my headlamp illuminating the way. The limestone walls were slick with moisture, and I could hear the distant drip of water echoing through the chamber. As I rounded a bend, my light fell upon something that made me pause. Claw marks, deep, jagged grooves carved into the stone wall. I approached slowly, my heart rate picking up. These weren't like any claw marks I'd seen before. They were too high up the wall for a bear, too large for a wolf or lynx. And the pattern, it was almost methodical, as if whatever had made them had been trying to communicate. I pulled out my camera, snapping several photos. As I lowered the device, something crunched under my boot. I looked down and felt my blood run cold. Bones. Scattered across the cave floor were dozens of bones, some clearly animal, others disturbingly human-like. "Okay, Lena," I said aloud, my voice shaky. "Time to get out of here and call in the authorities." But as I turned to leave, a low growl echoed through the cavern. It wasn't the sound of shifting rocks or water. It was distinctly animal and close. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Slowly, I turned my head, scanning the darkness beyond the reach of my headlamp. For a moment, all I could see was blackness. Then, two eyes reflected in the light, set high off the ground. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. "Is someone there?" No response came, just another low growl that seemed to vibrate through the very stone beneath my feet. I took a step backward, my foot sliding on the damp cave floor. In that moment of imbalance, something moved in the shadows. It was massive, easily 7 or 8 feet tall, and covered in what looked like thick, matted fur. Terror gripped me, and I ran. I sprinted back the way I'd come, my headlamp bouncing wildly, casting frantic shadows across the cave walls. Behind me, I could hear heavy footsteps and the sound of labored breathing. As I neared the cave entrance, my foot caught on an outcropping of rock. I went down hard, pain shooting through my ankle. I scrambled to my feet, limping towards the fading daylight. I burst out of the cave, gasping for air. The forest around me was silent, unnaturally so. No bird song, no rustling leaves, just the sound of my own ragged breathing. I glanced back at the cave entrance, half expecting to see the creature emerge, but there was nothing, just the yawning darkness of the cavern mouth. With shaking hands, I pulled out my satellite phone and dialed my team leader. "Marcus, it's Lena. We have a situation." "Lena? What's wrong? You sound terrible." I took a deep breath, trying to steady my voice. I found something in the cave, something that shouldn't be there. I need you to contact the local authorities and maybe bring some firepower when you come tomorrow." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Firepower? Lena, what exactly did you see in there?" I opened my mouth to explain, then closed it again. How could I describe what I'd encountered? Who would believe me? "Just trust me on this, Marcus. Something dangerous is living in that cave. We need to be prepared." After hanging up, I made my way back to my campsite, constantly looking over my shoulder. As night fell, I sat by my small fire, jumping at every sound from the surrounding forest. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those reflective eyes staring back at me from the darkness. I kept my flashlight close, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. It was nearing dawn when I heard it, a long, mournful howl that echoed through the mountains. It wasn't like any wolf I'd ever heard. It was deeper, almost guttural, with an almost human-like quality that sent shivers down my spine. As the first light of day began to filter through the trees, I heard the sound of vehicles approaching. Relief flooded through me as I saw the familiar SUVs of my research team, along with several police cars. Marcus was the first to reach me, his face etched with concern. "Lena, you look like hell. What happened out here?" I opened my mouth to explain, but the words caught in my throat. How could I possibly describe what I'd seen? Before I could answer, one of the local police officers approached, his expression grim. "Ms. Novak, we're going to need you to show us this cave you reported." I nodded, swallowing hard. As we made our way back towards the cavern, I recounted what I'd seen, the claw marks, the bones, the creature in the shadows. I could see the skepticism in their eyes, but they listened politely. As we neared the cave entrance, the officer in charge held up a hand, stopping the group. "Wait here," he said, drawing his weapon. "We'll do an initial sweep." I watched as he and two other officers disappeared into the darkness of the cave. Minutes ticked by, the tension palpable among those of us waiting outside. Suddenly, shouting erupted from within the cavern, followed by the sound of gunshots. My heart leapt into my throat as the officers came running out, their faces pale with fear. "Call for backup," the lead officer barked into his radio, "and get these civilians out of here, now!" As Marcus ushered me and the rest of the team back towards the vehicles, I caught a glimpse of something emerging from the cave. It was just for a moment, but it was enough to confirm my worst fears. The creature stood in the cave mouth, its massive form silhouetted against the darkness. It let out a roar that shook the very ground beneath our feet, then melted back into the shadows. In the chaos that followed, the arrival of more police, the evacuation of the area, the endless questions from authorities, one thought kept circling in my mind. What had we awakened in that cave? And more importantly, could it ever be contained again? As I sat in the back of an ambulance, a shock blanket draped over my shoulders, a young police officer approached me. "Ms. Novak, I need to ask you to keep what you saw here today to yourself. For now, at least. We don't want to cause a panic." I nodded numbly, knowing that even if I wanted to talk about it, who would believe me? The creature in the cave defied explanation, challenged everything I thought I knew about the natural world. As we drove away from the site, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Whatever lived in that cave, whatever ancient secret we had disturbed, was now awake, and I had a sinking feeling that it wouldn't stay hidden for long. The mountains loomed in the rearview mirror, dark and foreboding. Somewhere in those peaks, something was stirring, something that had been waiting a very long time to be discovered, and I, Lena Novak, had been the one to find it. For better or for worse, my life would never be the same again. Story 19. The cave mouth yawned before me, a gaping maw of darkness that seemed to swallow the fading daylight. I hesitated at the threshold, my headlamp casting eerie shadows on the rough stone walls. Something about this place felt wrong, but curiosity pushed me forward. I had no idea that stepping into that cavern would change my life forever. My name is Lena Novak, and I'm a geologist specializing in cave formations. Or at least I was. Now I'm not sure what I am. Perhaps a witness to something that shouldn't exist, or maybe just another victim of the wilderness. It was supposed to be a routine expedition. The Carpathian Mountains were rich with unexplored cave systems, and my team had been granted permission to survey a newly discovered network near the Ukrainian border. I'd volunteered to do an initial sweep of the main cavern, mapping out the basic structure before the rest of the team arrived the next day. The first thing that struck me as I entered the cave was the smell. Most caves have a distinct odor: damp earth, minerals, sometimes the musty scent of bat guano. But this This was different. It was a heavy, animal musk that made my nose wrinkle in disgust. Just some local wildlife, I muttered to myself, trying to shake off the unease that had settled in my gut. I moved deeper into the cavern, my headlamp illuminating the way. The limestone walls were slick with moisture, and I could hear the distant drip of water echoing through the chamber. As I rounded a bend, my light fell upon something that made me pause. Claw marks. Deep, jagged grooves carved into the stone wall. I approached slowly, my heart rate picking up. These weren't like any claw marks I'd seen before. They were too high up the wall for a bear, too large for a wolf or lynx, and the pattern, it was almost methodical, as if whatever had made them had been trying to communicate. I pulled out my camera, snapping several photos. As I lowered the device, something crunched under my boot. I looked down and felt my blood run cold. Bones. Scattered across the cave floor were dozens of bones, some clearly animal, others disturbingly human-like. "Okay, Lena," I said aloud, my voice shaky. "Time to get out of here and call in the authorities." But as I turned to leave, a low growl echoed through the cavern. It wasn't the sound of shifting rocks or water. It was distinctly animal and close. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Slowly I turned my head, scanning the darkness beyond the reach of my headlamp. For a moment, all I could see was blackness. Then, two eyes reflected in the light, set high off the ground. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. "Is someone there?" No response came, just another low growl that seemed to vibrate through the very stone beneath my feet. I took a step backward, my foot sliding on the damp cave floor. In that moment of imbalance, something moved in the shadows. It was massive, easily 7 or 8 feet tall, and covered in what looked like thick, matted fur. Terror gripped me, and I ran. I sprinted back the way I'd come, my headlamp bouncing wildly, casting frantic shadows across the cave walls. Behind me, I could hear heavy footsteps and the sound of labored breathing. As I neared the cave entrance, my foot caught on an outcropping of rock. I went down hard, pain shooting through my ankle. I scrambled to my feet, limping towards the fading daylight. I burst out of the cave, gasping for air. The forest around me was silent, unnaturally so. No birdsong, no rustling leaves, just the sound of my own ragged breathing. I glanced back at the cave entrance, half expecting to see the creature emerge. But there was nothing, just the yawning darkness of the cavern mouth. With shaking hands, I pulled out my satellite phone and dialed my team leader. "Marcus, it's Lena. We have a situation." "Lena? What's wrong? You sound terrible." I took a deep breath, trying to steady my voice. I found something in the cave, something that shouldn't be there. I need you to contact the local authorities. And maybe bring some firepower when you come tomorrow." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Firepower? Lena, what exactly did you see in there?" I opened my mouth to explain, then closed it again. How could I describe what I'd encountered? Who would believe me? "Just trust me on this, Marcus. Something dangerous is living in that cave. We need to be prepared." After hanging up, I made my way back to my campsite, constantly looking over my shoulder. As night fell, I sat by my small fire, jumping at every sound from the surrounding forest. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those reflective eyes staring back at me from the darkness. I kept my flashlight close, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. It was nearing dawn when I heard it, a long, mournful howl that echoed through the mountains. It wasn't like any wolf I'd ever heard. It was deeper, almost guttural, with an almost human-like quality that sent shivers down my spine. As the first light of day began to filter through the trees, I heard the sound of vehicles approaching. Relief flooded through me as I saw the familiar SUVs of my research team, along with several police cars. Marcus was the first to reach me, his face etched with concern. "Lena, you look like hell. What happened out here?" I opened my mouth to explain, but the words caught in my throat. How could I possibly describe what I'd seen? Before I could answer, one of the local police officers approached, his expression grim. "Ms. Novak, we're going to need you to show us this cave you reported." I nodded, swallowing hard. As we made our way back towards the cavern, I recounted what I'd seen, the claw marks, the bones, the creature in the shadows. I could see the skepticism in their eyes, but they listened politely. As we neared the cave entrance, the officer in charge held up a hand, stopping the group. "Wait here," he said, drawing his weapon. "We'll do an initial sweep." I watched as he and two other officers disappeared into the darkness of the cave. Minutes ticked by, the tension palpable among those of us waiting outside. Suddenly shouting erupted from within the cavern, followed by the sound of gunshots. My heart leapt into my throat as the officers came running out, their faces pale with fear. "Call for backup," the lead officer barked into his radio, "and get these civilians out of here, now!" As Marcus ushered me and the rest of the team back towards the vehicles, I caught a glimpse of something emerging from the cave. It was just for a moment, but it was enough to confirm my worst fears. The creature stood in the cave mouth, its massive form silhouetted against the darkness. It let out a roar that shook the very ground beneath our feet, then melted back into the shadows. In the chaos that followed, the arrival of more police, the evacuation of the area, the endless questions from authorities, one thought kept circling in my mind. What had we awakened in that cave? And more importantly, could it ever be contained again? As I sat in the back of an ambulance, a shock blanket draped over my shoulders, a young police officer approached me. "Ms. Novak, I need to ask you to keep what you saw here today to yourself. For now, at least, we don't want to cause a panic." I nodded numbly, knowing that even if I wanted to talk about it, who would believe me? The creature in the cave defied explanation, challenged everything I thought I knew about the natural world. As we drove away from the site, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Whatever lived in that cave, whatever ancient secret we had disturbed, was now awake, and I had a sinking feeling that it wouldn't stay hidden for long. The mountains loomed in the rearview mirror, dark and foreboding. Somewhere in those peaks, something was stirring, something that had been waiting a very long time to be discovered. And I, Lena Novak, had been the one to find it. For better or for worse, my life would never be the same again. Story 20. The elk carcass lay before me, a gruesome tableau of violence that defied explanation. Its massive body had been torn apart with a savagery that no known predator in these woods could muster. As I crouched beside the remains, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Something was watching me from the shadows of the forest, something that shouldn't exist. My name is Omar Khalil, and I've been a hunter in these mountains for over 2 decades, but nothing in my years of experience could have prepared me for what I encountered that day. It had started as a routine tracking expedition. I'd been following the trail of what I thought was an unusually large bear, hoping to gather data for the local wildlife conservation group. The signs were puzzling from the start. Tracks too large for any bear I'd ever seen, bark stripped from trees at impossible heights, and an eerie silence that seemed to follow the trail. As I pushed deeper into the forest, the underbrush became denser, the trees older and more gnarled. The air grew thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, but underneath it all was a musky odor I couldn't place. That's when I found the elk. I've seen plenty of predator kills in my time, but this was different. The elk's ribcage had been crushed as if it were made of twigs, its limbs torn clean from the body. What struck me most were the bite marks, massive, deep impressions that spoke of jaws powerful enough to shatter bone. "What the hell did this?" I muttered, pulling out my camera to document the scene. As I snapped photos, a twig snapped in the underbrush behind me. I spun around, my hand instinctively going to the hunting knife at my belt. The forest had gone completely silent, not even the chirp of a bird to break the eerie stillness. "Hello?" I called out, immediately regretting the decision. Whatever had killed the elk was still out there, and I'd just announced my presence. A low growl answered me, so deep I felt it in my chest more than heard it. It came from a dense thicket about 20 yards away, and as I watched, the bushes began to move. My heart pounded as I slowly backed away, eyes fixed on the rustling foliage. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but years of experience told me that would be a fatal mistake. Whatever was in there, I didn't want to trigger its chase response. As I retreated, a massive form began to emerge from the thicket. At first, all I could make out was dark, matted fur. Then I saw the eyes, amber orbs that glowed with an intelligence that sent a chill down my spine. The creature rose to its full height, easily 8 feet tall, its broad shoulders hunched as it regarded me. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't anything I'd ever seen before. Its body was a nightmarish blend of ape and man, covered in thick fur, with arms that hung nearly to the ground. For a moment, we just stared at each other. I could hear its heavy breathing, see the steam rising from its nostrils in the cool mountain air. Then it took a step forward, and I broke. I ran. I ran harder than I'd ever run in my life, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for stealth or direction. Behind me, I could hear the creature giving chase, its powerful strides eating up the distance between us. My lungs burned as I sprinted, ducking under low-hanging branches and leaping over fallen logs. I could hear the creature getting closer, its breathing growing louder. In desperation, I veered sharply to the left, hoping to throw it off. My foot caught on an exposed root, and I went down hard. Pain shot through my ankle as I scrambled to my feet, but I knew it was too late. I turned to face my pursuer, drawing my hunting knife in a futile gesture of defiance. The creature burst into the small clearing where I'd fallen, its massive form blocking out the dappled sunlight. It loomed over me, and I caught the full force of its musky odor, so strong it made my eyes water. I brandished my knife, knowing it would be useless against this behemoth, but unwilling to go down without a fight. "Stay back!" I shouted, my voice cracking with fear. To my utter shock, the creature paused, its head tilted slightly, regarding me with those intelligent eyes. Then it did something I never could have expected. It spoke. The sound was guttural, barely recognizable as speech, but I understood it all the same. No harm. I lowered my knife slightly, my mind reeling. You can talk?" The creature nodded slowly, its massive hand gesturing to itself. "Protect forest. Leave." I nodded frantically, my whole body trembling. Okay, I'm leaving. I won't come back, I promise." It stepped aside, its eyes never leaving me as I edged past. As soon as I was clear, I turned and limped away as fast as my injured ankle would allow. I didn't look back until I'd reached the trailhead where I'd parked my truck. As I fumbled with my keys, I glanced back at the forest. For a brief moment I thought I saw a large, dark figure watching me from between the trees. Then it was gone, leaving me to question if I'd imagined the whole encounter. But I knew I hadn't. The photos on my camera and the lingering scent on my clothes were proof enough. As I drove back to town, my mind raced with the implications of what I'd seen. A creature that shouldn't exist, that could speak, that claimed to protect the forest. I pulled into the parking lot of the local ranger station, my hands shaking as I cut the engine. I had a decision to make. I could report what I'd seen, show them the photos, potentially unleash a media frenzy and a hunt for the creature. Or I could keep quiet, protect the secret of the forest and the being that guarded it. As I sat there, wrestling with my conscience, a tap on my window made me jump. It was Dave, one of the senior rangers, peering at me with concern. "Omar, you okay, buddy? You look like you've seen a ghost." I forced a smile, my decision made in that moment. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just a long day in the woods, you know?" Dave nodded sympathetically. "Find anything interesting out there?" I hesitated for a moment, then shook my head. Nah, just the usual. Hey, listen, I'm thinking about taking some time off, maybe explore some other areas for a while. Dave raised an eyebrow. Really? I thought you loved these mountains. I do, I said, glancing back at the forest looming in the distance. But sometimes it's good to leave things be, you know? As I drove home that evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that my encounter in the woods had changed me forever. The world was bigger, stranger, and far more mysterious than I had ever imagined. And somewhere in those mountains, a guardian was watching, protecting its domain from those who would disturb it. I knew I would never hunt in those woods again. Some secrets, I realized, were better left undiscovered, but I also knew that I would carry the memory of those amber eyes and that rumbling voice with me for the rest of my life. The mountains loomed in my rearview mirror, dark and foreboding as the sun set behind them. For a moment, I thought I saw a large figure silhouetted against the skyline. Then it was gone, melting back into the forest that was its home. I turned my eyes back to the road ahead, heading towards a future that suddenly seemed full of new possibilities and unanswered questions. The encounter had shaken my understanding of the world, but it had also filled me with a sense of wonder I hadn't felt since I was a child. As I drove into the gathering darkness, one thought kept circling in my mind. In a world where such creatures could exist, what other marvels might be out there, waiting to be discovered? Story 21. The camera shook in my hands as I rewound the footage, my heart pounding in my chest. What I'd captured on film defied explanation, challenged everything I thought I knew about the natural world. There, in a split second of blurred motion, was something that shouldn't exist, a creature that would change my life forever. My name is Inez Cardoso, and I'm a wildlife documentary filmmaker, or at least I was. Now, I'm not sure what I am, perhaps a witness to something extraordinary, or maybe just another victim of the wilderness. It had started as a routine shoot in the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest. My small crew and I were documenting the elusive coastal wolves, a project that had taken months of preparation. We'd set up our base camp in a small clearing, surrounded by towering cedars and the constant mist that seemed to cling to everything in this part of the world. On our third night in the forest, I was reviewing the day's footage in my tent when I first noticed it. A dark blur at the edge of the frame, moving with impossible speed. At first I dismissed it as a trick of the light, maybe a bird flying close to the lens. But something about it nagged at me. I called over to my camera operator, Miguel, who was tending the campfire outside. "Hey, can you come take a look at this?" Miguel ducked into the tent, his brow furrowed. "What's up, boss?" I rewound the footage, pointing at the screen. "There in the background, do you see that?" He leaned in, squinting. That's weird. Doesn't look like any animal I've ever seen move like that." We spent the next hour analyzing the footage, slowing it down frame by frame. The more we looked, the stranger it became. The blur resolved into a vaguely humanoid shape, but far too large to be a person. And the way it moved, it was like nothing I'd ever seen before. "What do you think it is?" Miguel asked, his voice hushed. I shook my head, unable to tear my eyes from the screen. "I don't know, but I intend to find out." The next day, we adjusted our cameras to cover a wider area, hoping to catch another glimpse of whatever it was we'd seen. As we worked, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The forest seemed quieter than usual, the typical chorus of birds and small animals noticeably absent. As night fell, an eerie tension settled over our camp. We huddled around the fire, speaking in hushed tones. "I don't like this," our sound technician Aisha muttered. "Something feels off." I was about to respond when a twig snapped in the darkness beyond our camp. We all froze, eyes straining to penetrate the gloom. "Hello?" I called out, immediately regretting it. "Is someone there?" No response came, but I could have sworn I heard heavy breathing just at the edge of hearing. "Everyone, get in your tents," I ordered, trying to keep my voice steady. "Lock them up tight." We retreated to our shelters, the oppressive silence of the forest broken only by the sound of zippers being pulled closed. I lay in my sleeping bag, every muscle tense, straining to hear any sound from outside. That's when the vocalization started. It began as a low, rumbling sound, almost like a growl, but not quite. It rose in pitch, becoming a wail that sent chills down my spine. It wasn't like any animal call I'd ever heard before. It sounded almost human, but not quite. I fumbled for my recorder, determined to capture the sound. As I pressed record, the wailing stopped abruptly, replaced by the sound of heavy footsteps circling our camp. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure whatever was out there could hear it. The footsteps paused outside my tent, and I held my breath, certain that at any moment the thin fabric would be torn away, but nothing happened. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps moved away, fading into the forest. When dawn finally broke, I unzipped my tent with shaking hands. The campsite looked undisturbed at first glance, but as I stepped out, my blood ran cold. Encircling our entire camp were massive footprints, easily twice the size of my own. "Oh my God," Aisha whispered, emerging from her tent. "What made those?" I shook my head, unable to form words. Miguel joined us, his face pale. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice trembling. "Now." But I couldn't leave, not yet. Whatever had visited our camp last night, whatever had made those inhuman sounds, I needed to know more. "We'll pack up," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "But first, I want to check the cameras." As Miguel and Aisha began breaking down the camp, I retrieved our motion-activated cameras from the surrounding trees. My hands shook as I plugged the memory cards into my laptop. Most of the footage showed nothing unusual, just the normal nocturnal activities of the forest. But then I saw it. A massive figure moving with impossible speed through the trees. It was only on screen for a split second, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. The creature was easily 8 feet tall, covered in dark, matted fur. Its arms were unnaturally long, nearly reaching the ground. And its face was a nightmarish blend of ape and human features, with eyes that seemed to glow in the infrared light of the camera. "Inez?" Miguel's voice made me jump. "We're ready to go. Did you find anything?" I hesitated, my finger hovering over the delete button. Part of me wanted to erase the footage, to pretend we'd never seen anything out of the ordinary, but the journalist in me, the part that had always sought the truth no matter the cost, wouldn't let me. "Yeah," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I found something." As we hiked back to civilization, our packs heavy with equipment and unanswered questions, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves made me jump. We were about a mile from the trailhead when I heard it, that same haunting vocalization from the night before. I spun around, my camera at the ready. There, at the edge of the trail, stood the creature. It was even more imposing in daylight, its massive form casting a long shadow. For a moment we just stared at each other. Then, to my utter shock, it spoke. The sound was guttural, barely recognizable as speech, but I understood it all the same. "Go. Never return." I nodded frantically, unable to form words. The creature held my gaze for a moment longer, then turned and melted into the forest with surprising grace for its size. We ran the rest of the way to the trailhead, not stopping until we reached our vehicle. As we drove away, the forest looming in the rearview mirror, I knew our lives would never be the same. The footage we'd captured would change everything. Our understanding of the natural world, the legends of Bigfoot and Sasquatch that had persisted for generations. But as I clutched the memory cards containing our evidence, a different question nagged at me. Should we reveal what we'd found? Or were some secrets better left in the forest, protected by their mysterious guardians? As we drove into the gathering darkness, one thought kept circling in my mind. In a world where such creatures could exist, what other marvels might be out there, waiting to be discovered? And more importantly, were we ready for the truths they might reveal? The mountains faded into the distance, but I knew the memory of those glowing eyes and that rumbling voice would stay with me forever. Whatever I decided to do with our footage, one thing was certain: my view of the world and my place in it had been irrevocably changed.